Hi everyone, welcome to Red Umbrella. I hope you're all doing well. Today, I want to argue that Stan Smith from American Dad reveals fascinating psychological patterns beneath his comedic surface. His extreme patriotism, rigid worldview, and controlling behavior all point to someone whose identity depends on external validation, whose confidence masks deep insecurity, and whose emotional life is severely restricted. By examining Stan's family dynamics, emotional responses, decision-making patterns, and reactions to challenges, we can understand the psychology driving his character and why he behaves the way he does. But before we begin, I'd just like to kindly ask you all to subscribe. It's completely free and it really helps us improve the videos for this wonderful community we've managed to build. Anyway, that's enough. Let's begin. Stan Smith's Personality Foundation. Stan Smith is the central character of American Dad, an animated sitcom that premiered in 2005 and was created by Seth MacFarlane, the same person who created Family Guy. The show follows Stan and his family living in Langley Falls, Virginia. Stan works for the CIA as an agent, and this job is not just what he does for a living. It defines who he is as a person. From the very first episode, the show establishes Stan as someone whose entire personality revolves around patriotism, conservative values, and an unwavering belief that he is right about everything. A psychologist observing Stan would immediately notice that his personality is built on rigid structures. Stan does not just have opinions, he has absolute certainties that he refuses to question. He believes America is the greatest country in the world, without exception. He believes the CIA is always doing the right thing. He believes traditional family values are the only correct way to live. These beliefs are not casual preferences that Stan holds lightly. They are the foundation of his entire sense of self. Every decision he makes, every relationship he has, and every action he takes flows from these core certainties. In the pilot episode, titled Pilot, which aired in February 2005, we see Stan's character established clearly from the opening scenes. He works for the CIA and takes his job extremely seriously. He brings the same intensity to his home life. He tries to control what his family does, what they believe, and how they behave. He gives speeches about patriotism at the dinner table. He sees threats to American values everywhere, even in his own household. The episode shows Stan as someone who cannot separate his professional identity from his personal identity. Being a CIA agent is not what Stan does, it is who Stan is. When he comes home from work, he does not leave his CIA mindset behind. He applies the same suspicious, controlling approach to his family that he uses in his professional life. This merger of professional role and personal identity is something a psychologist would find significant. When someone's sense of self is completely tied to an external role, it creates vulnerability. If that role is ever questioned or threatened, the person's entire identity feels attacked. This helps explain why Stan reacts so extremely when anyone challenges the CIA, questions America, or suggests that his worldview might be wrong. He is not just defending ideas, he is defending himself. His professional identity has become so intertwined with his personal identity that separating them would feel like losing himself entirely. Stan's personality also shows what psychologists call rigidity. Rigidity means being inflexible and unable to adapt to new information or changing circumstances. Stan demonstrates this constantly throughout the series. When he forms an opinion, he does not reconsider it based on evidence. When he makes a plan, he does not adjust it when circumstances change. When he believes something is right, he cannot imagine any other perspective might be valid. This rigidity extends to every area of his life. He is rigid in his political beliefs, rigid in his parenting style, rigid in his marriage expectations, and rigid in his view of how the world works. In the episode All About Steve from season 1, Stan becomes convinced that his son Steve's new friend is secretly a terrorist. He has no real evidence for this belief. He simply decides it must be true based on stereotypes and assumptions. When everyone tells Stan he is wrong, he does not reconsider. Instead, he becomes more determined to prove his theory correct. He investigates the friend obsessively. He ignores all evidence that contradicts his belief. He follows the boy around, searches through his belongings, and creates elaborate conspiracy theories to explain away any evidence of innocence. Eventually, Stan's paranoia nearly destroys Steve's friendship and embarrasses the entire family. This pattern repeats throughout the series. Stan forms rigid beliefs and then refuses to let go of them, regardless of what reality shows him. him. A psychologist would also notice Stan's need for control.
Control is a major theme in Stan's behavior across hundreds of episodes. He needs to control what his family does, what they think, and how they live. He creates elaborate rules for the household. He monitors everyone's activities.
He intervenes in situations where he has no business being involved. This need for control often creates the main conflict in episodes. Stan cannot simply let things happen naturally, or trust other people to make their own decisions. He must direct everything and everyone around him. In Francine's flashback from season 1, Stan becomes worried that his wife Francine might remember her wild past before they met. He goes to extreme lengths to prevent her from recovering these memories because he fears losing control over how she sees herself and their relationship. He does not trust Francine to remember her past and still choose to stay with him. He needs to control her understanding of her own history. The episode shows Stan going to increasingly desperate measures to keep Francine from learning about who she was before they married. A psychologist might interpret this as revealing Stan's deep insecurity about whether people would choose him if they had other options, or if they knew the full truth about themselves and their alternatives. Stan's personality also shows a strong tendency toward black and white thinking. Black and white thinking means seeing everything in extremes with no middle ground. Things are either completely good or completely bad. People are either allies or enemies. Actions are either right or wrong, with no gray area. Stan demonstrates this thinking pattern constantly. He cannot hold nuanced views where something might be partially good and partially bad. Everything must fit into clear categories. This makes his world simpler to navigate, yet it also means he cannot respond appropriately to complex situations that require flexibility and judgment. In the episode Homeland Insecurity from season 1, Stan becomes convinced that his neighbors are terrorists based on minimal evidence. He does not consider that they might be innocent people who happen to look Middle Eastern. In Stan's mind, they are either definitely terrorists or definitely not, and he has decided they are terrorists. He cannot hold the more nuanced view that they are probably innocent people who deserve not to be harassed. His black and white thinking leads him to extreme actions that harm innocent people. He surveils them, breaks into their home, and reports them to authorities. When he is eventually proven wrong, he does not learn from this experience. He simply moves on to the next situation where his black and white thinking will cause problems. The foundation of Stan's personality also includes a strong authoritarian streak. Authoritarianism in psychology refers to a personality type that values obedience to authority, maintains strict hierarchies, and believes in harsh punishment for those who break rules. Stan demonstrates all these characteristics consistently. He demands obedience from his family. He believes in strict social hierarchies where some people are inherently better than others. He thinks harsh punishment is the appropriate response to misbehavior. He does not believe in rehabilitation or understanding. He believes in consequences and discipline. Throughout the series, Stan frequently uses his authority as father and as a CIA agent to demand compliance from others. He does not persuade or negotiate. He commands and expects to be obeyed. When his authority is questioned, he becomes angry and tries to reassert dominance. A psychologist would note that this authoritarian approach to relationships prevents genuine intimacy and trust. People cannot be authentic around someone who demands obedience rather than inviting honest communication. Stan's family learns to hide things from him, to tell him what he wants to hear, and to work around his rules rather than honestly engaging with him. Stan's personality foundation also includes what could be called defensive certainty. This means using absolute confidence as a defense against doubt and anxiety. Stan rarely admits uncertainty about anything. He speaks with complete conviction, even when he clearly does not know what he is talking about. This serves a psychological function. By never showing doubt, Stan protects himself from having to feel uncertain or vulnerable. Uncertainty would be uncomfortable for someone with Stan's rigid personality structure, so he defends against it by insisting he knows everything. He would rather be confidently wrong than admit he might not have all the answers. In countless episodes, Stan makes declarations about topics he knows nothing about. When someone corrects him or provides information that contradicts him, he does not say, "I did not know that," or "maybe I was wrong." Instead, he finds ways to dismiss the new information and maintain his original position. He might attack the credibility of the person correcting him, he might change the subject, he might double down on his incorrect belief. This pattern protects his self-image as someone who is always right,
yet it also prevents him from learning and growing.
Stan cannot develop as a person because development requires admitting you were wrong about something, and Stan cannot tolerate that admission. The show also establishes early that Stan's personality includes a strong need to be seen as masculine. Masculinity for Stan means being tough, unemotional, dominant, and traditional. He constantly performs this version of masculinity, even when it is clearly not serving him well. He mocks anything he perceives as weak or feminine. He refuses to show vulnerability or ask for help. He measures his worth by how well he fits this narrow definition of what a man should be. Episodes show him going to absurd lengths to prove his masculinity, often putting himself and others in danger just to demonstrate that he is man enough. A psychologist would recognize this as toxic masculinity, which is a term that describes harmful gender norms that restrict men's emotional lives and relationships. Stan's version of masculinity prevents him from being emotionally available to his family, from forming genuine friendships, and from taking care of his own mental health. He has learned that showing emotion is weakness and that men must always be in control. These lessons harm him and everyone around him. His son Steve struggles with Stan's expectations of masculinity. His wife Francine feels emotionally abandoned by a husband who cannot be vulnerable. Stan himself suffers from stress and anxiety that he cannot acknowledge or address because doing so would violate his masculine identity. Stan's personality foundation was formed by his childhood experiences, which the show reveals gradually through flashbacks across multiple episodes. His father was absent for most of his childhood and eventually abandoned the family entirely. His mother struggled to raise him alone. Stan experienced poverty and instability as a child. These experiences taught him that the world is dangerous and that he must be strong to survive. He learned that showing vulnerability leads to being hurt. He learned that having rigid beliefs and strong convictions provides a sense of safety in an uncertain world. The chaos of his childhood made him crave order and control in his adult life. A psychologist would see how these childhood experiences shaped Stan's adult personality. The need for control makes sense when you grew up feeling powerless. The rigid beliefs make sense when you grew up needing certainty in a chaotic environment. The performance of extreme masculinity makes sense when you grew up without a father and had to figure out how to be a man on your own without guidance. Stan's personality is a defense mechanism that developed to protect a vulnerable child who was trying to survive difficult circumstances. The problem is that he has carried these defenses into adulthood where they no longer serve him well and actually prevent him from having the security and connection he craves. The foundation of Stan's personality also includes a strong sense of duty and responsibility. Despite all his flaws, Stan genuinely believes he is doing the right thing. He thinks his job at the CIA protects America from threats. He thinks his strict parenting will help his children succeed in life. He thinks maintaining traditional values will keep his family safe and happy. He is not intentionally trying to harm anyone. He is trying to be a good agent, a good father, and a good American. His methods are often terrible, and his beliefs are often wrong. Yet his intentions come from a genuine desire to protect and provide for the people he loves. This combination of traits creates a personality that is simultaneously strong and fragile. Stan projects confidence and control, yet underneath lies deep insecurity and fear. He acts certain about everything, yet this certainty is a defense against doubt and anxiety. He demands obedience, yet this demand comes from a fear of chaos and disorder. Understanding this foundation helps make sense of all of Stan's behaviors throughout the series. Every extreme action, every rigid belief, every controlling impulse flows from this core personality structure that was established in the earliest episodes and remains remarkably consistent throughout the show's run across multiple seasons. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. This personality foundation shapes everything about how Stan sees himself. Nowhere is this more visible than in how completely his identity is tied to his patriotic beliefs and his role as a defender of America. Section 2. Identity through patriotic beliefs. Stan Smith's identity is inseparable from his patriotism. A psychologist observing Stan would note that his sense of who he is depends entirely on his relationship to America and American values. This is not ordinary love of country that many people feel. This is identity fusion, where the boundary between self and group becomes blurred or disappears entirely. Stan does not just love America. In his mind, he is America. Any threat to America is a threat to Stan personally.
Any criticism of America is a criticism of Stan himself. This fusion of personal and national identity drives much of his behavior throughout the series, and explains why he reacts so intensely to situations that others might see as simple disagreements. In the episode Con Air from Season 3, Stan discovers that his father, who abandoned him as a child, is still alive and wants to reconnect after many years. Stan's first concern is not about their personal relationship or the emotional weight of this reunion. It is about whether his father is patriotic enough and shares Stan's values about America. Stan measures people's worth by how much they love America. He cannot separate his personal feelings from his political and national beliefs. Even in a moment that should be about family reconciliation and addressing childhood wounds, Stan's identity as a patriot dominates everything else. He needs his father to validate his patriotic worldview before he can even consider having an emotional connection with him. A psychologist would recognize this as placing ideology above relationships. When beliefs become more important than people, it indicates that those beliefs are serving a deep psychological need. For Stan, patriotism provides structure, meaning, and purpose in ways that personal connections apparently cannot. It tells him who he is, what he should do, and how to measure his worth. Without these beliefs, Stan would have to confront questions about identity and meaning that might be uncomfortable or frightening. The beliefs protect him from existential uncertainty and offer clear answers in a confusing world. Stan's patriotic identity also requires constant validation from external sources. He needs America to be great so that being American makes him great by association. He needs the CIA to be heroic and morally right so that being a CIA agent makes him heroic and morally right. He needs traditional values to be correct so that following them makes him correct. His self-worth depends on these external validations rather than coming from internal sources like personal achievements or character development. This creates psychological vulnerability because Stan's worth is tied to things outside his control. In the episode Tearjerker from Season 3, which is a James Bond parody where the characters play different spy movie roles, Stan plays a super spy, saving the world from villains. Even in this fantasy episode that exists outside normal continuity, his heroic identity is tied to serving his country rather than to any personal qualities he might possess. Stan cannot imagine being heroic just because he is a good person who wants to help others. He can only be heroic as an agent of American power and authority. A psychologist would note that this external locus of identity makes Stan vulnerable in ways he does not recognize. The show demonstrates repeatedly that Stan's patriotism is not really about policy positions or political philosophy in any deep sense. It is about identity and belonging. Stan does not have coherent political beliefs that he has thought through carefully and can defend with logic. Instead, he has adopted a package of beliefs that mark him as belonging to a particular group. Being conservative, being pro-military, being suspicious of foreigners. These positions are identity markers more than reasoned conclusions. In Black Mystery Month from Season 2, Stan initially refuses to acknowledge that Black people have made contributions to America. This position is not based on historical knowledge. It is based on his identity as someone who holds traditional conservative views. When evidence forces him to change his mind during the episode, he does not gradually adjust his thinking. Instead, he flips to the opposite extreme and decides Black people invented everything important in civilization. This pattern shows Stan's beliefs are about group membership rather than truth. This kind of extreme thinking shapes how Stan processes information in every area of his life. When he encounters new facts or perspectives, he does not evaluate them on their merits. Instead, he asks whether accepting this information would threaten his identity as a patriotic American conservative. If the answer is yes, he rejects the information regardless of evidence. If the answer is no, he accepts it without question. A psychologist would recognize this as motivated reasoning, where the desired conclusion determines what evidence gets accepted rather than evidence determining the conclusion. Stan's brain is constantly working to protect his identity rather than to understand truth. This identity protective reasoning also affects how Stan interprets the actions and motivations of people around him. He divides the world into people who share his patriotic identity and people who do not. Those who share it are automatically trustworthy and good. Those who do not are automatically suspicious and potentially dangerous. This creates severe blind spots in Stan's judgment.
He trusts people he should not trust, simply because they display the right patriotic signals. He distrusts people who would actually help him, simply because they do not fit his narrow definition of a good American. This pattern leaves him vulnerable to manipulation by anyone who knows how to speak his ideological language. A psychologist might describe Stan as having a foreclosed identity. Identity foreclosure describes adopting an identity without going through exploration and questioning. Instead of trying different beliefs to see what fits, a person with foreclosed identity commits early to an identity given by authority figures or cultural expectations. Stan committed to patriotism and conservatism without exploring other options. He accepted the identity that was available and expected, and he built his entire sense of self around it. This foreclosed identity makes Stan resistant to change and growth. People with foreclosed identities often become anxious when exposed to different perspectives because considering alternatives would threaten their sense of self. Stan exhibits this anxiety constantly. When someone presents information that contradicts his worldview, he does not get curious. He gets defensive and angry. He feels personally attacked, even when someone is simply offering a different perspective. His identity is so rigid that new information feels threatening. Stan's identity also requires having enemies to define himself against. His patriotism is defined more by what he opposes than by what he supports. He needs terrorists, criminals, and un-American threats to fight against. Without enemies, his role as protector becomes unnecessary and his identity loses purpose. This creates a psychological incentive to find threats even where none exist. If Stan cannot find real enemies, he will invent them. In Helios from Season 3, Stan accidentally turns his daughter Haley into a sleeper agent programmed to kill through one of his CIA schemes. When the programming activates and Haley tries to carry out an assassination, Stan treats this as validation of his worldview about constant threats. He does not reflect on how he created the danger himself. Instead, he sees it as proof that he was right to be vigilant. A psychologist would note this as confirmation bias, where Stan interprets everything as supporting beliefs he already holds. The show reveals that Stan's patriotic identity comes with a strong need to prove himself worthy. He constantly tries to demonstrate that he is American enough, patriotic enough, and loyal enough. This suggests underlying insecurity about whether he truly belongs. People who are secure in their identity do not need to constantly prove it. The fact that Stan repeatedly goes to extremes to demonstrate his patriotism indicates doubt underneath the surface. In Chimdale from Season 8, Stan becomes obsessed with proving he is better than a neighbor at being American. He enters into an escalating competition over who can display more patriotism through flags and other symbols. This competition becomes absurd as both men try to out-American each other. A psychologist watching this episode would see someone whose identity is so fragile that even minor challenges trigger intense defensive reactions. Stan cannot simply be secure in who he is. He must constantly prove it. The anxiety driving this need to prove himself runs deep in Stan's psychology. Every interaction becomes an opportunity to either confirm or threaten his status as a good American. When someone questions any aspect of his beliefs or behaviors, Stan experiences it as an attack on his fundamental worthiness as a person. This creates exhausting vigilance, where Stan is always monitoring himself and others for signs that his identity might be in question. He cannot relax into genuine confidence because his sense of self depends on constant external validation. A psychologist would recognize this as indicating that Stan's patriotic identity, despite appearing strong and certain on the surface, actually rests on a foundation of deep insecurity and self-doubt. Stan's patriotic identity also serves to simplify a complex world. By dividing everything into American versus un-American, good versus evil, us versus them, Stan creates a clear framework for understanding reality. He does not have to deal with moral ambiguity or complicated situations where there are no clear right answers. Everything fits into his simple categories. This simplification is psychologically comforting because it reduces anxiety, yet it also distorts his perception of reality. The show demonstrates that Stan cannot handle nuance or complexity in moral situations. In episode after episode, he reduces complicated issues to simple binaries, where everything must be completely good or completely bad. A psychologist would recognize this as a defense mechanism against anxiety. Complexity and ambiguity create anxiety because they require tolerance for uncertainty. Stan has very low tolerance for uncertainty, so he defends against it by forcing everything into simple categories. Stan's identity through patriotism also affects how he parents his children. He tries to transmit his beliefs to them not as optional perspectives they might consider, but as essential truths they must accept. When his children question American values or show interest in other worldviews, Stan experiences this as a personal betrayal. He cannot separate his children's development of their own identities from his own need to have his identity validated. In episodes featuring his daughter Haley, who is liberal and often challenges Stan's conservative views, Stan's distress is extreme. He does not respond to her disagreements as a parent engaging with an independent-minded child. He responds as someone whose entire identity is being attacked. Their political arguments are not really about policy. They are about Stan needing his daughter to confirm that his identity is correct and valid. A psychologist would observe that Stan's patriotic identity leaves little room for a personal identity separate from his roles. Stan rarely expresses preferences or interests that are just his own. He does not have hobbies unrelated to patriotism or work. He does not have personal goals beyond being a good agent and a good American. When asked who he is, Stan would likely describe his role and his beliefs, rather than any qualities that are uniquely his. The show occasionally reveals moments where Stan's patriotic identity fails to provide the meaning and security it promises. In Bullocks to Stan from Season 3, Stan faces a crisis when his boss at the CIA becomes romantically involved with his wife, Francine. Stan's identity as a CIA agent and as a husband come into conflict. He does not know how to be himself outside of these roles. When the roles conflict, he experiences genuine identity confusion. Stan's reliance on patriotic identity also means he has difficulty connecting with people who do not share this identity. He struggles to understand or empathize with anyone whose worldview differs from his own. He cannot imagine that someone might be a good person while holding different beliefs. This limits his relationships and prevents him from learning from diverse perspectives. The show explores how Stan's patriotic identity creates distance in his family relationships. His wife Francine often feels like Stan cares more about America than about her. His children feel like they must perform patriotism to earn his approval. His relationships are conditional on others accepting and validating his identity, rather than being based on mutual understanding. This creates a family dynamic where everyone must manage Stan's identity needs rather than being themselves. In examining Stan's identity through patriotism, a psychologist would see someone using ideology as a substitute for developing a genuine sense of self. Stan has outsourced his identity to America and the CIA, rather than doing the difficult work of figuring out who he is independent of these external sources. This strategy provides short-term comfort and certainty, yet it leaves him vulnerable and prevents authentic connection with others. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. This dependence on external identity through patriotism connects directly to how Stan manages his emotional life. He has developed rigid patterns of suppressing feelings that might threaten his carefully constructed self-image. Section 3. Emotional expression and repression. Stan Smith's relationship with his own emotions is one of the most psychologically revealing aspects of his character. A psychologist observing Stan would immediately notice that he has severe difficulty expressing or even acknowledging feelings that he perceives as weak or vulnerable. Throughout the series, Stan demonstrates a pattern of emotional repression that is tied directly to his need to maintain his masculine identity and his role as a strong protector. He has learned that showing emotion is dangerous, that vulnerability leads to being hurt, and that real men keep their feelings locked away. This emotional repression affects every relationship in his life and creates internal conflicts that occasionally break through his defenses in unexpected ways. From the earliest episodes, the show establishes that Stan responds to almost every situation with anger or aggression, rather than with more vulnerable emotions. When he feels hurt, he gets angry. When he feels scared, he becomes aggressive. When he feels sad or disappointed, he channels those feelings into rage or action. This pattern is so consistent that other characters in the show expect it. His family knows that Stan will not cry at a funeral, will not admit when he is frightened, and will not express affection in direct ways. This emotional limitation is presented as a core part of who Stan is and how he navigates the world around him. In the episode Tears of a Clooney from Season 2, Stan reveals that he physically cannot cry. His tear ducts have been sealed as part of his CIA training. This physical inability to cry serves as a perfect metaphor for Stan's emotional repression. The show takes something psychological and makes it literal and visible. Stan has literally blocked his ability to express one of the most basic human emotions. When situations arise that would make most people cry, Stan experiences physical discomfort instead. His body wants to release emotion through tears, yet he has made this physiologically impossible through deliberate intervention. A psychologist would recognize this as an extreme form of emotional suppression taken to its logical conclusion. Stan has not just learned to hide his tears or suppress crying in public. He has actually altered his body to prevent emotional expression entirely. This shows how completely he is committed to the idea that showing vulnerability is unacceptable under any circumstances. The episode treats this as ridiculous and absurd, yet it also reveals something true about Stan's character. He would rather experience physical pain and discomfort than show emotional vulnerability to others, or even to himself. The show demonstrates repeatedly that Stan's emotional repression creates significant problems in his marriage. His wife Francine needs emotional connection and intimacy that Stan simply cannot provide. In numerous episodes throughout the series, Francine expresses frustration that Stan never talks about his feelings, never shows vulnerability, and never gives her access to his inner emotional life. Stan responds to these requests with confusion or anger. He does not understand why Francine would want him to be emotional or vulnerable. In his mind, being unemotional is a strength that should make him more attractive as a partner, not less attractive. In Rough Trade from Season 1, Stan trades Francine to a stranger for a car because he is too emotionally disconnected to recognize her value to him as a person. He treats his wife like a possession that can be exchanged for something he wants more in that moment. Only when he loses her does he begin to recognize the emotions he has been suppressing. The episode shows Stan struggling to identify and express feelings that have always been there, but that he has never acknowledged or named. A psychologist would see this as an example of how emotional repression damages relationships by preventing genuine intimacy and connection between partners. Stan's emotional repression also affects his relationship with his children in profound ways. He struggles to express love or affection for them directly through words or gestures. Instead, he shows care through actions, like protecting them or providing for them financially. His son Steve desperately wants emotional connection with his father. In many episodes throughout the series, Steve tries to get Stan to open up emotionally or to show affection, and Stan consistently fails to do so. Stan can tell Steve what to do or how to behave, yet he cannot tell Steve that he loves him or that he is proud of him. These emotional expressions feel impossible for Stan to access or communicate. In Con Air, when Stan reconnects with his own father, we see where this emotional repression originally comes from in Stan's life. Stan's father was also emotionally distant and unable to show affection or vulnerability. Stan learned from his father that men do not express feelings, that emotional vulnerability is weakness, and that love is shown through actions rather than words. Stan is repeating this exact pattern with his own son, passing down emotional repression from one generation to the next. A psychologist would recognize this as a cycle of emotional unavailability that damages family bonds across multiple generations. The show also reveals that Stan's emotional repression extends to positive emotions as well as negative ones. He has difficulty expressing joy, excitement, or enthusiasm except in very specific contexts related to his patriotic identity or his work at the CIA. When good things happen in his personal life, Stan often cannot fully enjoy them because he is uncomfortable with intense, positive emotions. He dampens his own happiness and cannot allow himself to be fully present in moments of joy or celebration with his family. In episodes where the family celebrates holidays or special occasions, Stan often ruins these moments because he cannot handle the emotional intensity they require. Christmas episodes frequently show Stan struggling with the sentimentality and emotional openness that the holiday traditionally demands. He tries to control every aspect of the celebration to avoid having to feel genuine emotion. A psychologist would see this as a defense mechanism. By staying busy and maintaining control of external circumstances, Stan protects himself from having to experience vulnerable feelings internally. Stan's emotional repression also manifests in his inability to process grief or loss in healthy ways. When bad things happen to him or to people he cares about, Stan does not allow himself to mourn or to feel sad. Instead, he becomes more rigid, more controlling, and more aggressive toward others. He tries to fix problems with action rather than processing the emotional impact of what has occurred. This pattern prevents him from healing from emotional wounds and causes those wounds to affect his behavior in ways he does not recognize or understand. In Meter Maid from Season 1, Stan loses his job at the CIA temporarily and experiences a crisis of identity. Instead of acknowledging the fear and sadness this creates, Stan becomes obsessed with his new job as a taxi driver. He throws himself into this work with the same intensity he brought to the CIA, using constant activity to avoid feeling the emotions that job loss naturally creates. A psychologist would recognize this as emotional avoidance through compulsive activity and workaholism. The show occasionally reveals moments when Stan's emotional repression cracks and genuine feelings break through to the surface. These moments are always portrayed as significant and unusual because they are so rare for Stan. When he does express vulnerability or show genuine emotion, it catches everyone around him off guard. His family does not know how to respond because they are not used to seeing this side of him. These breakthrough moments suggest that underneath Stan's rigid exterior lies a whole emotional life that he keeps hidden from others and from himself. Stan's emotional repression also affects his ability to recognize emotions in others around him. Because he cannot acknowledge his own feelings, he struggles to empathize with the emotional experiences of people in his life. When his wife or children are upset, Stan often does not notice or does not understand what they are feeling. He misses emotional cues that others would pick up easily. This emotional blindness creates misunderstandings and conflicts that could be avoided if Stan had better emotional awareness and empathy. A psychologist would recognize that Stan's emotional repression requires constant effort and energy to maintain. Suppressing emotions is exhausting work that takes a psychological toll. Stan must constantly monitor himself to make sure no vulnerable feelings leak out. He must redirect every emotional impulse into approved channels like anger or action. This constant vigilance takes a toll even though Stan does not recognize it. The energy he spends managing his emotions is energy that could go toward genuine connection or personal growth. The show also demonstrates that Stan's emotional repression is connected to his fear of being seen as weak or feminine. Any emotion that feels soft or vulnerable threatens his masculine identity. He has learned that men should be strong and stoic, that showing feelings is something women do, and that emotional men are not real men. This toxic belief system traps Stan in a very narrow range of acceptable emotional expression. He can be angry, proud, or determined, yet he cannot be sad, scared, or tender without feeling like he is failing as a man. In episodes where Stan is forced into situations that require emotional expression, he experiences genuine distress and discomfort. His discomfort is physical and visceral. A psychologist would see this as anxiety triggered by approaching something that feels forbidden and dangerous. Stan has built such strong walls around his emotions that dismantling them even briefly feels terrifying to him. Stan's emotional repression also prevents him from seeking help when he needs it. Because he cannot acknowledge vulnerability, he cannot admit when he is overwhelmed, confused, or in need of support from others. He suffers alone, with problems that could be solved if he could ask for help. This isolation makes his struggles worse and prevents him from developing healthier coping mechanisms. The show occasionally suggests that Stan's emotional repression is maintained through conscious effort rather than being natural to him. There are moments when emotions well up and Stan physically pushes them down. He swallows hard, takes a deep breath, and forces himself to maintain his stoic exterior. These moments reveal that Stan is actively suppressing feelings rather than simply not having them. A psychologist would recognize this as a learned behavior that requires ongoing reinforcement. Stan's emotional repression also means he has limited vocabulary for discussing feelings with others. He does not have words to describe emotional experiences beyond the most basic labels. When forced to talk about feelings, Stan uses vague language or deflects into talking about actions and behaviors instead. This linguistic limitation both reflects and reinforces his emotional limitation. Without words for emotions, he cannot think about them clearly or communicate them to others. In examining Stan's emotional life, a psychologist would see someone who has constructed an elaborate system to avoid vulnerability at all costs. This system protects Stan from feeling pain or showing weakness, yet it also prevents him from experiencing the full range of human emotions. His emotional repression limits his relationships, damages his mental health, and keeps him isolated even when surrounded by family. The defenses he built to protect himself have become a prison that prevents genuine connection and authentic self-expression. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown.
These patterns of emotional repression shape how Stan approaches his most important role. His inability to process or express feelings directly influences how he functions as the family protector. Section 4. Stan's role as family protector. Stan Smith's identity as protector of his family is one of his most defining characteristics throughout the series.
A psychologist observing Stan would note that he sees protecting his family as his primary purpose and the main way he demonstrates love and worth. Throughout the series, Stan makes decisions based on what he believes will keep his family safe, even when those decisions are extreme, unnecessary, or actively harmful to the people he claims to protect. His role as protector is not just something he does. It is fundamental to how he understands himself as a husband and father. This creates a pattern where Stan's need to feel like a protector often matters more than whether his family actually needs protection or wants the kind of protection he provides. From the pilot episode onward, the show establishes that Stan sees threats everywhere around him. His CIA training and paranoid worldview combine to make him perceive danger in situations that are perfectly safe. A neighbor walking their dog becomes a potential terrorist in Stan's eyes. A stranger in town becomes a possible spy. His children's normal developmental experiences become dangers that must be controlled and managed. Stan does not assess threats rationally or proportionally. Instead, he assumes everything is dangerous until proven otherwise. This hypervigilance is presented as part of his protective role, yet a psychologist would recognize it as anxiety and control issues disguised as care for his family. In Homeland Insecurity from Season 1, Stan becomes convinced his neighbors are terrorists based on nothing more than stereotypes about their appearance and background. He surveils them obsessively, breaks into their home to search for evidence, and reports them to authorities. Stan genuinely believes he is protecting his family and community from danger. The fact that his neighbors are completely innocent does not factor into his thinking at all. In Stan's mind, the possibility of danger justifies any action he takes to investigate or prevent it. A psychologist would recognize this as an example of how Stan's need to feel like a protector creates actual harm while he believes he is doing good. Stan's protective behavior extends to controlling every aspect of his family's lives in minute detail. He monitors where they go, who they spend time with, and what activities they engage in. He creates rules about acceptable behavior and enforces those rules rigidly, without room for negotiation or flexibility. He makes decisions for his family members without consulting them about what they want or need. All of this control is justified in Stan's mind as protection. He genuinely believes that if he does not control everything, his family will be in danger. A psychologist would recognize that this level of control is not about protection at all. It is about Stan's anxiety and his need to feel powerful. In his relationship with his wife Francine, Stan's protective role creates significant problems in their marriage. He treats Francine like someone who needs constant protection, rather than as an equal partner capable of making her own decisions. He does not trust her judgment about situations. He does not believe she can keep herself safe. He intervenes in situations where Francine is handling things perfectly well on her own. This patronizing behavior is presented as Stan caring about Francine's safety, yet it actually communicates that he sees her as incompetent and childlike. In Francine's flashback, Stan goes to extreme lengths to prevent Francine from remembering her past because he fears what she might remember will threaten their relationship. He frames this as protecting her from painful memories, yet he is actually protecting himself from the possibility that Francine might make different choices if she had full knowledge of her own history. A psychologist would see this as Stan using the language of protection to justify controlling behavior that serves his own needs rather than Francine's well-being. Stan's role as protector also affects how he parents his son Steve in deeply harmful ways. Steve is portrayed throughout the series as sensitive, artistic, and non-athletic, traits that Stan sees as weaknesses that leave Steve vulnerable to danger and ridicule. Rather than accepting Steve as he is, Stan constantly tries to toughen him up, make him more masculine, and prepare him for dangers Stan believes Steve will face. Stan genuinely thinks he is protecting Steve by pushing him to be different than his natural personality. He does not recognize that his rejection of who Steve actually is creates emotional harm.
In multiple episodes throughout the series, Stan forces Steve into situations meant to make him more manly or more capable of self-defense. These situations often backfire and put Steve in actual danger that would not exist if Stan had left things alone.
Stan's need to feel like he is protecting and preparing his son matters more to him than whether his methods actually work or whether Steve wants this kind of preparation. A psychologist would observe that Stan is trying to protect Steve from becoming like Stan was as a child, vulnerable and abandoned. He projects his own childhood fears onto Steve.
Stan's protective role with his daughter Haley takes a different form that reflects his gender assumptions. Because Haley is liberal and makes choices Stan disapproves of, he sees her as in constant danger from her own poor judgment. He does not respect her as an independent adult capable of making her own decisions. He tries to control who she dates, where she goes, and what causes she supports. He believes he is protecting her from making mistakes, yet he is actually trying to prevent her from living according to her own values. The show demonstrates repeatedly across many episodes that Stan's protection often creates more danger than it prevents. His paranoid interventions escalate safe situations into actual crises. His refusal to trust his family's judgment leads to them hiding things from him, which creates the exact vulnerabilities he fears. His controlling behavior pushes his children to rebel in ways that put them at real risk. A psychologist would recognize this as a self-fulfilling prophecy, where Stan's protective measures create the very dangers he is trying to prevent. In Helios, Stan's attempt to prepare Haley for danger by turning her into a sleeper agent results in her actually trying to kill someone when the programming activates. His protection became the threat. This pattern repeats across many episodes throughout the series. Stan's certainty that he knows what his family needs for protection leads him to take actions that harm them. He cannot see that his judgment about danger is flawed because his role as protector is too central to his identity to question. Stan's protective role also prevents his family members from developing their own skills and independence. Because Stan handles everything he perceives as dangerous, his family never learns to assess risk or protect themselves. Francine becomes dependent in ways she might not be if Stan allowed her more autonomy. Steve does not develop confidence because Stan constantly communicates that Steve cannot handle things alone. Haley rebels against Stan's protection by making deliberately risky choices to assert her independence. A psychologist would observe that Stan's protective role serves his psychological needs more than it serves his family's actual safety needs. Being a protector makes Stan feel valuable and necessary. It gives him purpose and justifies his controlling behavior. If his family did not need protection, Stan would have to find other ways to demonstrate worth and love. He has not developed those other ways, so he needs his family to be vulnerable so he can be strong. The show also reveals that Stan's protective role is connected to his childhood experiences of feeling unprotected. His father abandoned him, and his mother struggled to keep him safe. Stan experienced poverty and instability as a child. He learned that the world is dangerous and that you cannot trust others to protect you. As an adult, he has overcorrected by becoming hypervigilant and overprotective. He is trying to give his family what he did not have, yet he cannot recognize that his family's needs are different from what his needs were as a child. In episodes where Stan's family faces actual danger, his protective instincts do sometimes prove useful. He has genuine skills and resources that help in crisis situations. The problem is that Stan operates in crisis mode all the time, treating every situation as equally dangerous. A psychologist would describe this as an inability to calibrate threat response appropriately. Stan has two settings: maximum protection or no protection. He cannot recognize that most situations require something in between these extremes. Stan's protective role also affects how he interacts with people outside his family. He sees anyone his family spends time with as a potential threat that must be investigated and assessed. New friends, romantic partners, teachers, neighbors, all are treated with suspicion until proven safe. This makes it difficult for his family to form relationships because Stan creates conflict with people who are perfectly harmless. His protective instinct extends so far that it isolates his family from normal social connections. The show demonstrates that Stan's family often has to work around his protective instincts to live normal lives. They hide things from him, lie about where they are going, and sneak around to do perfectly normal activities that Stan would interfere with if he knew. This deception becomes necessary for basic functioning. A psychologist would observe that when protection becomes control, families develop these patterns of secretiveness as a survival mechanism. Stan's role as protector
also connects to his need for control and his intolerance for uncertainty. If he can control everything his family does, he can eliminate uncertainty about their safety. He cannot tolerate not knowing whether they are safe, so he tries to eliminate that uncertainty through total control of their activities. This is psychologically impossible because complete safety does not exist, and complete control damages relationships. Stan's attempt to achieve the impossible keeps him in a constant state of stress and vigilance. The show occasionally reveals moments when Stan recognizes that his protective behavior is harmful to his family. These moments of insight are rare and usually quickly forgotten. Stan will admit he went too far in a particular situation, yet he does not change the underlying pattern of behavior. His identity as protector is too important to modify, even when he sees evidence that it causes problems. A psychologist would see this as an example of how core identity roles resist change even when they are dysfunctional. Stan's protective role also prevents him from seeing his family members as they actually are. He sees them as vulnerable dependents who need his intervention, rather than as complex individuals with their own strengths and capabilities. This distorted perception damages his relationships because his family feels unseen and disrespected. They know Stan loves them, yet they also know he does not truly see or understand them as people. In examining Stan's role as family protector, a psychologist would see someone whose care for his family is real, yet whose expression of that care is deeply problematic. Stan genuinely wants to keep his family safe. His intentions are good and sincere, yet his methods are controlling. His judgments are flawed, and his inability to trust his family creates the very vulnerability and danger he fears. His role as protector has become a compulsion that serves his psychological needs for control and purpose more than it serves his family's actual needs for safety and autonomy. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. This compulsive need to protect others reveals something deeper about Stan's psychology. Beneath his aggressive confidence and need for control lies profound insecurity that shapes everything he does. Section 5. Insecurity beneath overconfidence. Stan Smith projects extreme confidence in almost every situation he encounters. He speaks with absolute certainty about his opinions, makes bold decisions without hesitation, and presents himself as someone who knows exactly what he is doing at all times. A psychologist observing Stan would immediately recognize this excessive confidence as overcompensation. The louder and more certain someone appears on the outside, the more likely they are hiding doubt and insecurity on the inside. Stan's constant need to prove himself, his extreme reactions to minor challenges, and his inability to admit mistakes all point to someone who is deeply insecure beneath his aggressive exterior. Throughout the series, the show reveals moments where Stan's insecurity breaks through his confident facade. These moments are revealing because they show what Stan works so hard to hide the rest of the time. When his confidence is threatened, Stan does not respond with calm reassurance. He responds with panic, anger, and increasingly desperate attempts to prove himself. This pattern indicates that his confidence is not based on genuine self-assurance. Instead, it is a defensive shell protecting a vulnerable core. In the episode Surrogate from Season 4, Stan becomes obsessed with proving he is still young and virile after his wife Francine becomes a surrogate for another couple. Stan cannot handle the idea that he might be getting older or losing his physical capabilities. He throws himself into extreme athletic competitions to prove his youth. When he fails at these competitions, he does not accept his limitations gracefully. Instead, he becomes more desperate and takes dangerous risks to demonstrate capabilities he no longer has. A psychologist would see this as someone whose self-worth depends entirely on external markers of success and competence, rather than internal acceptance of who he is. Stan's insecurity also appears in how he responds to criticism or correction. When someone points out that Stan is wrong about something, even in a minor factual matter, Stan cannot simply acknowledge the mistake and move on. He becomes defensive and angry. He argues against obvious facts. He creates elaborate justifications for why he was actually right all along. This inability to admit being wrong indicates deep insecurity about his intelligence and competence. If Stan were truly confident, he could acknowledge mistakes without his entire sense of self being threatened. The show demonstrates this pattern repeatedly across many episodes. In situations where a truly confident person would simply say they were mistaken, Stan doubles down on his incorrect position. He would rather look foolish defending an obviously wrong position than admit he did not know something.
A psychologist would recognize this as ego fragility.
Stan's sense of self is so fragile that even small admissions of imperfection feel dangerous.
In The Vacation Goo from Season 3, Stan reveals that he has been drugging his family every year and putting them in isolation tanks while showing them fake vacation memories instead of taking real vacations. When his family discovers this deception, Stan cannot simply apologize for lying to them for years. Instead, he tries to justify his behavior and convince them that his fake vacations were actually better than real ones would have been. He cannot tolerate being seen as wrong or as having failed his family. A psychologist would observe that Stan's need to be right matters more to him than his relationships or his integrity. Stan's insecurity also manifests in his constant need for recognition and validation from authority figures. Despite his outward confidence, Stan desperately needs approval from his boss at the CIA and from other people he sees as important. In numerous episodes, Stan goes to extreme lengths to gain approval or avoid disapproval from Deputy Director Bullock. He compromises his values, betrays his family, and puts himself in danger, all to maintain his standing with his boss. This need for external validation indicates that Stan does not have a secure internal sense of worth. In Bullock's to Stan from Season 3, Stan's boss becomes romantically involved with Francine, and Stan experiences a crisis because he cannot choose between loyalty to his boss and loyalty to his wife. A truly confident person would have clear boundaries and would not struggle with this choice. Stan's struggle reveals that his sense of worth depends on approval from authority figures. Without that approval, he does not know who he is or what he should do. The show also reveals Stan's insecurity through his obsession with masculinity and appearing strong. Stan constantly performs masculinity in exaggerated ways. He refuses to show vulnerability, avoids anything he considers feminine, and repeatedly proves his toughness through unnecessary displays of aggression. This performance indicates that Stan is not secure in his masculinity. Men who are genuinely confident in their manhood do not need to constantly prove it. The fact that Stan is always demonstrating how masculine he is suggests he has doubts about whether he measures up to his own standards of what a man should be. In Lincoln Lover from Season 2, Stan discovers that the Log Cabin Republicans are a group of gay conservatives and experiences a crisis about his own sexuality and masculinity. Stan's extreme discomfort with anything that might suggest he is not completely heterosexual reveals deep insecurity. A psychologist would observe that people who are secure in their sexual identity do not experience this kind of panic when exposed to situations that might challenge traditional gender norms. Stan's reaction shows he is constantly monitoring himself to make sure he is masculine enough. Stan's insecurity also appears in his relationship with his son, Steve. Stan is often critical of Steve for being sensitive, artistic, and physically weak. On the surface, this seems like Stan wanting Steve to be successful and capable. Looking deeper, a psychologist would recognize that Stan sees Steve as a reflection of himself. Steve's weaknesses remind Stan of his own childhood vulnerabilities. Stan was also weak and vulnerable as a child before he built his defensive shell of aggression and confidence. Criticizing Steve is a way of rejecting the weak parts of himself that he has spent his life trying to hide. In All About Steve from Season 1, Stan becomes obsessed with making Steve more popular and successful because Steve's social struggles embarrass him. Stan cannot separate Steve's identity from his own. When Steve fails, Stan experiences it as his own failure as a father and as a man. A psychologist would see this as projection. Stan projects his own insecurities onto his son, and then tries to fix those insecurities through controlling Steve's life. The show also demonstrates Stan's insecurity through his extreme competitiveness. Stan cannot engage in friendly competition. Every competition becomes a life or death battle for superiority. Whether he is competing with neighbors, coworkers, or even his own family members, Stan must win at all costs. This desperate need to win indicates that losing feels like a fundamental threat to his worth as a person. In Chimdale from Season 8, Stan becomes locked in an escalating competition with a neighbor over who is more patriotic and American. What starts as a minor disagreement becomes an all-consuming battle because Stan cannot tolerate the idea that someone might be better than him at anything, especially something tied to his core identity. A psychologist would recognize that people who are secure in their worth can lose competitions without it threatening their sense of self. Stan's inability to accept defeat
reveals deep insecurity. Stan's insecurity also appears in how he handles financial matters. Despite having a stable job and income, Stan is often paranoid about money and status. He worries constantly about maintaining his middle-class lifestyle and being seen as successful. In various episodes, Stan makes impulsive financial decisions trying to appear wealthier or more successful than he actually is. This status anxiety indicates that Stan measures his worth by external markers of success rather than by internal values. The show reveals that much of Stan's insecurity stems from his childhood experiences of poverty and abandonment. Growing up without a father and with limited financial resources created a sense of vulnerability and inadequacy that Stan never resolved. Instead of processing these childhood wounds, Stan built a personality designed to prove he had overcome them. His confidence, his toughness, his success at the CIA, all of these are meant to demonstrate that he is no longer the weak, abandoned boy he once was. In Con Air, when Stan reconnects with his father, we see how much Stan still seeks his father's approval, despite pretending not to care. Stan wants his father to see him as successful and capable. He wants validation that he turned out well, despite being abandoned. A psychologist would observe that Stan's childhood wounds still drive much of his adult behavior. The insecurity created by early abandonment never healed. Stan just learned to hide it better. Stan's insecurity also manifests in his relationships outside his immediate family. He struggles to maintain genuine friendships because his need to appear superior creates distance. In his friendship group, Stan often acts like he is the leader and the most important member. He cannot be vulnerable with his friends or admit when he needs help. This prevents real intimacy and leaves Stan isolated even when surrounded by people who care about him. The show demonstrates that Stan's overconfidence serves as armor, protecting him from having to confront his insecurities directly. As long as he can maintain the performance of being certain, strong, and successful, he does not have to acknowledge the doubt and fear underneath. A psychologist would recognize this as a defense mechanism that worked when Stan was younger, but now prevents growth and authentic connection. Stan's insecurity also affects his decision-making in ways that create problems. Because he cannot admit doubt or uncertainty, Stan makes decisions quickly and commits to them absolutely, rather than taking time to consider options carefully. He mistakes quick decisions for strong decisions. He interprets careful consideration as weakness. This leads to poor choices that a more genuinely confident person would avoid through thoughtful analysis. In various episodes throughout the series, Stan's impulsive decisions create crises that could have been prevented if he had been willing to slow down and consider alternatives. His need to appear decisive and certain prevents him from making actually good decisions. A psychologist would observe that genuine confidence allows for uncertainty and careful thinking. Overconfidence that masks insecurity requires the performance of constant certainty. The show also reveals that Stan's insecurity makes him vulnerable to manipulation by people who know how to flatter him or appeal to his need for validation. When someone tells Stan he is important, capable, or special, Stan accepts this uncritically because it feeds his ego and soothes his insecurities. He does not question the motives of people who praise him. This leaves him open to being used by manipulators who understand his psychological needs. Stan's insecurity beneath his overconfidence creates a cycle that is difficult to break. The more insecure he feels, the more aggressively he performs confidence. The more he performs confidence, the less he can acknowledge his actual feelings and needs. This prevents him from developing genuine self-assurance based on self-acceptance, rather than on external validation. A psychologist would recognize that Stan is trapped in a pattern where his solution to insecurity creates more insecurity in the long run. In examining Stan's psychology, the contrast between his surface confidence and his underlying insecurity is one of the most important dynamics to understand. Stan is not simply an arrogant person who thinks too highly of himself. He is a deeply insecure person who has learned to hide that insecurity behind aggressive displays of certainty and strength. This pattern shapes his relationships, his parenting, his work, and his entire approach to life. Understanding this insecurity helps explain many of Stan's most problematic behaviors and reveals the vulnerability he works so hard to conceal. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Stan's insecurity drives him to maintain rigid patterns of thinking that protect him from uncertainty. His mind operates in absolutes and extremes that prevent nuanced understanding. Section 6. Cognitive rigidity and extremes. Stan Smith's thinking patterns are characterized by extreme rigidity and an inability to hold nuanced or complex ideas.
A psychologist observing Stan would note that he processes information through rigid categories of right and wrong, good and bad, us and them. He cannot tolerate ambiguity or uncertainty.
He cannot hold two seemingly contradictory ideas at the same time. He cannot adjust his thinking when presented with new information. This cognitive rigidity shapes how Stan understands the world and limits his ability to adapt to new situations or learn from experience. Throughout the series, Stan demonstrates a pattern of black and white thinking where everything must be categorized as completely one thing or completely another. There is no middle ground in Stan's worldview. People are either good or evil. Ideas are either right or wrong. Actions are either patriotic or treasonous. This binary thinking simplifies a complex world into something Stan can understand and control. Yet it also distorts his perception of reality in ways that create significant problems. In Black Mystery Month from Season 2, Stan demonstrates this pattern clearly when dealing with information about Black people's contributions to American history. Initially, Stan refuses to acknowledge any contributions at all, because this contradicts his existing beliefs. When evidence forces him to change his position, he does not develop a nuanced understanding that acknowledges both contributions and ongoing struggles. Instead, he swings to the opposite extreme and decides that Black people invented absolutely everything. A psychologist would recognize this as an inability to integrate new information into existing framework. Stan can only replace one extreme belief with another extreme belief. This pattern appears repeatedly throughout the series. When Stan learns new information, he does not adjust his thinking gradually or develop more sophisticated understanding. He either rejects the information entirely, or he adopts a new extreme position. There is no moderation or nuance in how Stan updates his beliefs. A psychologist would recognize this as cognitive rigidity that prevents learning and growth. Stan's rigid thinking also manifests in his inability to see situations from multiple perspectives. He has one way of understanding any given situation, and he cannot imagine that other people might see things differently for legitimate reasons. When people disagree with Stan, he does not consider that they might have valid points or different but reasonable perspectives. He assumes they are either stupid or malicious. This prevents him from learning from others and from developing empathy for people whose experiences differ from his own. In episodes featuring his daughter Haley, who holds liberal political views that oppose Stan's conservatism, Stan cannot engage with her ideas on their merits. He dismisses her perspectives automatically because they contradict his existing beliefs. He does not ask why she thinks the way she does or try to understand her reasoning. He simply rejects her views as wrong, without consideration. A psychologist would observe that this rigidity damages their relationship and prevents genuine communication between them. Stan's cognitive rigidity also appears in his approach to rules and authority. He follows rules absolutely and expects others to do the same. He cannot tolerate rule breaking, even when the rules are unjust or when following them creates harm. He sees rules as absolute standards that must be followed regardless of context or consequences. This rigid adherence to rules prevents Stan from exercising moral judgment in situations where blindly following rules would be wrong. The show demonstrates this pattern in episodes where Stan enforces rules that make no sense in context, or where his rule following creates worse outcomes than breaking the rules would have created. Stan cannot adjust his behavior based on circumstances because his rigid thinking does not allow for contextual judgment. A psychologist would recognize this as an inability to engage in moral reasoning beyond simple rule following. In Meter Maid from Season 1, Stan becomes a parking enforcement officer and enforces parking regulations with absurd rigidity. He tickets his own family members. He creates situations where people cannot possibly avoid getting tickets. He shows no mercy or consideration for circumstances. The rules are absolute in Stan's mind, and following them is more important than fairness or compassion. A psychologist would see this as cognitive rigidity applied to moral situations. Stan's rigid thinking also prevents him from recognizing when he is wrong or when his approach to a problem is not working. He develops a plan or a belief and then commits to it absolutely, regardless of evidence that it is failing. He interprets all outcomes as confirming his original position, rather than questioning whether his approach needs adjustment. This creates a pattern where Stan persists in failed strategies because he cannot adapt his thinking based on results.
In various episodes throughout the series, Stan continues with plans that are obviously not working because admitting failure would require cognitive flexibility he does not possess.
He would rather fail completely while maintaining his rigid beliefs than succeed by adapting his approach. A psychologist would recognize this as a defense against the anxiety that cognitive flexibility creates. Changing your mind requires tolerating uncertainty, and Stan has extremely low tolerance for uncertainty. The show also demonstrates Stan's tendency to catastrophize and think in extremes about outcomes and consequences. When something goes wrong, Stan does not assess the actual severity of the problem. Instead, he immediately jumps to worst-case scenarios. He treats minor setbacks as complete disasters. He interprets small mistakes as total failures. This extreme thinking prevents Stan from responding proportionally to problems and often makes situations worse than they need to be. Stan's cognitive rigidity also manifests in his inability to learn from experience in meaningful ways. Most people encounter situations that challenge their beliefs and gradually adjust their understanding over time. Stan encounters these situations constantly, yet he never changes. He might modify his behavior in a specific circumstance, yet his underlying beliefs and thinking patterns remain rigid. A psychologist would observe that Stan lacks the cognitive flexibility required for genuine learning and growth. In Con Air, when Stan interacts with his father who abandoned him, Stan has an opportunity to develop more complex understanding of family relationships, forgiveness, and human imperfection. Instead, Stan processes the experience through his existing rigid categories. He either accepts his father completely or rejects him completely. He cannot develop a nuanced understanding that acknowledges both the harm his father caused and the possibility of connection. A psychologist would see this as a missed opportunity for growth created by cognitive rigidity.
Stan's extreme thinking also appears in how he responds to threats and challenges. He does not calibrate his responses to the actual level of danger or difficulty. Every problem requires maximum effort and extreme measures in Stan's mind. He treats minor inconveniences like major crises. He responds to small disagreements like they are existential threats. This inability to distinguish between different levels of severity creates constant drama and escalation in Stan's life. The show demonstrates this pattern through Stan's work at the CIA, where he approaches every mission with the same level of intensity, regardless of actual importance. Stan does not have different modes for different situations. He has one mode, which is maximum intensity and extreme measures. A psychologist would recognize this as an inability to modulate responses based on context. Stan's rigid thinking also prevents him from recognizing complexity in moral situations. He believes strongly in good and evil as absolute categories. He cannot understand situations where good people do bad things, or where the right course of action is unclear. He needs moral clarity in all situations, even when reality offers none. This creates a pattern where Stan makes moral judgments quickly and absolutely, without considering the complexity of human behavior and motivation. In episodes where characters face genuine moral dilemmas with no clear right answer, Stan becomes frustrated and angry. He cannot tolerate moral ambiguity. He forces the situation into his rigid categories, even when this requires ignoring important information or dismissing legitimate competing values. A psychologist would observe that Stan's need for moral certainty prevents him from engaging in genuine ethical reasoning. Stan's cognitive rigidity also affects his ability to plan for the future and anticipate consequences. Because he thinks in extremes and absolutes, Stan has difficulty imagining how situations might develop in complex ways. He tends to think that his actions will have simple, predictable results. When outcomes are more complicated than he anticipated, Stan is surprised and unprepared. His rigid thinking prevents him from engaging in sophisticated scenario planning that considers multiple possible outcomes. The show reveals that Stan's cognitive rigidity is connected to his need for control and his anxiety about uncertainty. If Stan can force everything into simple, rigid categories, he does not have to deal with the anxiety that complexity creates. He can feel certain about his understanding of situations, even when that understanding is oversimplified and inaccurate. A psychologist would recognize this as a defense mechanism against the discomfort of not knowing. Stan's rigid thinking also prevents him from developing creativity and innovation in problem solving.
When faced with challenges, Stan applies the same approaches he has always used, rather than thinking creatively about new solutions. He has a limited repertoire of strategies, and he cannot develop new ones because that would require cognitive flexibility. This makes Stan predictable and ineffective in situations that require novel thinking. In various episodes, Stan's rigid approach to problems creates failures that could be avoided through more flexible thinking. Other characters around him often see creative solutions that Stan cannot see because his thinking is locked into familiar patterns. A psychologist would observe that cognitive rigidity severely limits Stan's effectiveness in many areas of his life. Stan's extreme thinking also appears in his emotional responses to situations. He does not have moderate emotional reactions. He experiences emotions in extremes. He goes from calm to enraged with nothing in between. He shifts from confident to devastated without passing through mild concern. This emotional extremity is connected to his cognitive rigidity. Because he thinks in absolutes, he feels in absolutes as well. The show demonstrates this through Stan's overreactions to minor problems. When something goes slightly wrong, Stan responds as if it is a catastrophe. When someone mildly criticizes him, Stan responds as if he has been completely rejected. A psychologist would recognize that this emotional intensity is both a cause and a consequence of rigid thinking. Extreme emotions reinforce extreme thoughts, and extreme thoughts generate extreme emotions. Stan's cognitive rigidity also prevents him from recognizing patterns in his own behavior. He repeats the same mistakes over and over without recognizing that he is doing so. He creates the same conflicts in different relationships without seeing his role in those conflicts. This lack of insight stems partly from his rigid thinking. If Stan cannot think flexibly about situations, he cannot recognize patterns across situations. In examining Stan's cognitive patterns, a psychologist would see someone whose thinking is governed by rigidity, extremity, and simplification. Stan cannot tolerate complexity, ambiguity, or uncertainty. He forces a complex world into simple, rigid categories that allow him to feel certain, even when certainty is not justified. This cognitive style protects Stan from anxiety in the short term, while creating significant problems in the long term. His rigid thinking prevents learning, damages relationships, and limits his effectiveness in almost every area of his life. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. These rigid thinking patterns shape how Stan interacts with the world beyond his family. His extreme beliefs and inflexible mind create a particular kind of social confidence that both helps and harms him. Section 7. Stan's social confidence and conflict. Stan Smith displays a particular kind of social confidence that sets him apart from how most people navigate social situations. A psychologist observing Stan would note that he enters almost every social interaction with complete certainty about his own rightness and importance. He does not experience the normal social anxieties that make most people careful about how they present themselves or concerned about how others perceive them. Stan believes he is right, he believes he is important, and he believes others should recognize both of these facts. This creates a social presence that is simultaneously commanding and off-putting. Stan's social confidence stems partly from his role as a CIA agent and his identity as a patriotic American. These sources of identity give him a sense of authority and importance that he carries into all social situations. When Stan enters a room, he expects to be the most important person there. When Stan speaks, he expects others to listen and agree. When Stan makes decisions, he expects others to follow. This expectation is so deeply ingrained that Stan rarely questions it or considers that others might see things differently. Throughout the series, the show demonstrates that Stan's social confidence is not based on actual social skills or emotional intelligence. Stan is not good at reading social cues, understanding other people's feelings, or navigating complex social dynamics. What he has is complete certainty in himself, combined with total disregard for whether others agree with his self-assessment. This creates a confidence that appears strong on the surface, while actually being quite socially tone-deaf. In the episode Homeland Insecurity from Season 1, Stan hosts a neighborhood watch meeting where he tries to convince his neighbors to be vigilant about terrorist threats. Stan's confidence in this situation is absolute. He presents outrageous claims with complete certainty. He dismisses reasonable objections from his neighbors. He cannot understand why people are not taking him as seriously as he takes himself. A psychologist would observe that Stan's social confidence prevents him from recognizing when he has lost his audience or when his approach is not working.
Stan's confidence also manifests in his complete lack of embarrassment about behaviors that would mortify most people. He does things in public that are socially inappropriate, yet he feels no shame. He says things that offend others, yet he does not apologize or modify his behavior. This lack of social shame is partly what creates his confidence. Most people's social behavior is regulated by fear of embarrassment or rejection. Stan does not have this fear, which frees him to behave with complete disregard for social norms. The show reveals this pattern in numerous episodes where Stan does embarrassing things in front of neighbors, coworkers, or strangers without any apparent awareness that he should be embarrassed. His family members are often mortified by his behavior, yet Stan remains unbothered. A psychologist would recognize this as either extremely high self-esteem or extremely low self-awareness. In Stan's case, it appears to be both. Stan's social confidence also affects how he handles conflict with others. When disagreements arise, Stan does not seek compromise or try to understand the other person's perspective. He simply asserts his position more loudly and more aggressively. He believes that confidence and volume are persuasive. He thinks that if he states his position with enough certainty, others will eventually accept that he is right. This approach to conflict rarely works, yet Stan continues to use it because he cannot imagine a different approach. In episodes featuring conflicts with his neighbors, Stan escalates rather than de-escalates. When someone disagrees with him, Stan treats it as a challenge to his authority rather than as an opportunity for dialogue. He becomes more entrenched in his position. He refuses to give any ground. He turns minor disagreements into major conflicts because he cannot tolerate the social experience of being wrong or having to compromise. In The Best Christmas Story Never from Season 2, Stan's conflict with his neighbor over Christmas decorations escalates into violence and property destruction. What starts as a minor disagreement becomes a war because Stan cannot back down from any conflict. His social confidence prevents him from recognizing when he is being unreasonable or when continuing a conflict is hurting him more than helping him. A psychologist would observe that Stan lacks the social intelligence to know when to retreat or compromise. Stan's confidence also makes him vulnerable to being manipulated by people who understand how to flatter his ego. When someone tells Stan he is important or special, Stan accepts this uncritically. He does not question the motives of people who praise him, because praise confirms his existing view of himself. This makes him easy to manipulate for anyone who knows how to appeal to his vanity and need for validation. The show demonstrates this pattern in episodes where characters manipulate Stan by playing to his ego. They tell him what he wants to hear about his importance or his rightness, and Stan immediately trusts them and follows their suggestion. A psychologist would recognize that genuine social confidence includes the ability to question praise and assess motives. Stan's confidence is so dependent on external validation that he cannot critically evaluate the people providing that validation. Stan's social confidence also prevents him from building genuine friendships based on mutual vulnerability and trust. His friendships tend to be based on shared activities or shared beliefs, rather than on emotional intimacy. Stan cannot be vulnerable with his friends because vulnerability would undermine the confident persona he maintains. This means his friendships remain superficial even after years of knowing people. In episodes featuring Stan's friend group, which includes neighbors and coworkers, Stan is often the dominant personality who directs activities and makes decisions for the group. He does not participate as an equal member. He leads and expects others to follow. A psychologist would observe that this dynamic prevents true friendship because it lacks the reciprocity and mutual respect that genuine friendship requires. Stan's confidence also affects how he responds to criticism or feedback from others. When someone criticizes Stan or points out a mistake he has made, Stan does not consider whether the criticism might be valid. Instead, he immediately rejects it and often attacks the person offering the criticism. He cannot separate criticism of his actions from criticism of his worth as a person. Any negative feedback threatens his carefully maintained self-image of competence and importance. The show reveals this pattern in workplace scenes where Stan's boss or coworkers try to give him feedback. Stan becomes defensive and argumentative rather than receptive. He cannot use criticism as an opportunity for growth because accepting that he did something wrong would undermine his social confidence. A psychologist would recognize this as a maladaptive response to feedback that prevents learning and improvement.
Stan's social confidence also manifests in his belief that rules and social norms apply to others but not to him. He expects others to follow social conventions while he himself ignores them when convenient. He believes his importance and his role give him special privileges. This creates a double standard where Stan judges others harshly for behaviors he engages in himself without recognizing the hypocrisy. In various episodes throughout the series, Stan breaks rules and social norms while simultaneously enforcing those same rules on his family and others. When confronted with this inconsistency, Stan does not see it as hypocrisy. He believes his position and judgment entitle him to different standards. A psychologist would observe that this self-serving application of rules is common among people whose confidence is based more on entitlement than on genuine self-worth. Stan's confidence also prevents him from recognizing his own limitations in social situations. He believes he is socially adept when he is actually quite clumsy in many social contexts. He misreads situations, offends people without realizing it, and fails to pick up on social cues that others see clearly. His confidence blinds him to his own social deficits, because acknowledging those deficits would require admitting he is not as capable as he believes. The show demonstrates this through situations where Stan completely misunderstands what is happening socially while remaining confident in his interpretation. Other characters can see that Stan is wrong, yet Stan cannot see it himself. A psychologist would recognize this as a lack of social self-awareness that is masked by excessive confidence. Stan's social confidence also creates problems in situations that require humility or deference. When Stan encounters someone with more authority, knowledge, or expertise, he does not defer to them appropriately. Instead, he challenges their authority or tries to demonstrate that he is equally important. He cannot occupy a subordinate position gracefully because it contradicts his self-image. In episodes featuring interactions with his CIA superiors, Stan often oversteps boundaries and challenges authority in ways that create problems for him. His confidence prevents him from recognizing when deference would be the wiser course. A psychologist would observe that appropriate social behavior requires the ability to modulate confidence based on context. Stan lacks this ability to adjust his presentation of self to different situations. The show also reveals that Stan's social confidence serves to protect him from deeper insecurities about social acceptance and belonging. By projecting extreme confidence, Stan prevents others from seeing his vulnerability, and prevents himself from having to feel it. If he admitted that he cares what others think or that he fears rejection, it would undermine the confident persona that protects him. Stan's confidence also affects how he handles being wrong in social situations. When Stan makes a social mistake or violates a norm, he does not apologize or try to repair the relationship. Instead, he either denies that any mistake occurred, or he justifies his behavior as correct, despite others seeing it as wrong. This prevents him from maintaining healthy social relationships because he cannot engage in the repair processes that relationships require. In examining Stan's social confidence, a psychologist would see someone whose outward certainty masks significant social deficits. Stan appears confident because he does not question himself or worry about others' perceptions. This creates a kind of social boldness that can be effective in some contexts. In situations requiring genuine connection, empathy, or self-awareness, Stan's confidence becomes a liability. He cannot build deep relationships or navigate complex social dynamics because his rigid confidence prevents the flexibility that social situations require. The show also demonstrates that Stan's social confidence creates a pattern where he dominates social situations rather than participating in them. He talks more than he listens. He asserts rather than discusses. He commands rather than collaborates. This makes him an exhausting person to be around for extended periods. People in Stan's life often feel steamrolled by his confidence rather than engaged with as equals. Stan's confidence also prevents him from experiencing personal growth through social interactions. Most people learn about themselves and adjust their behavior based on feedback from social experiences. Stan does not do this because he interprets all social experiences through the lens of his existing self-concept. When something goes wrong socially, Stan blames others or circumstances, rather than considering his own role. This pattern keeps him stuck in the same social behaviors throughout the series. In understanding Stan's social confidence, it becomes clear that what appears as strength is actually a form of rigidity. Stan's confidence is not the flexible, adaptive confidence that allows people to grow and connect. It is a fixed, defensive confidence that protects him from vulnerability while preventing genuine social connection and personal development.
Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown.
Stan's social confidence often leads him into situations where his certainty overrides caution. This pattern connects to a broader tendency toward impulsive decision-making that creates chaos in his life. Section 8. Risk-taking and impulsive decisions. Stan Smith makes decisions quickly and commits to them absolutely, without careful consideration of consequences or alternatives. A psychologist observing Stan would note that he displays a pattern of impulsive risk-taking that creates repeated crises in his life. Stan jumps into situations without planning, makes major decisions based on minimal information, and pursues courses of action that clearly carry significant risks without adequately assessing those risks. This impulsivity is connected to his need to appear decisive and his discomfort with the uncertainty that careful decision-making requires. Throughout the series, Stan demonstrates that he values the appearance of decisiveness more than the quality of decisions. He believes that making quick, confident decisions shows strength and leadership. He thinks that taking time to consider options or gather information shows weakness and indecision. This creates a pattern where Stan makes many bad decisions quickly, rather than taking time to make good decisions thoughtfully. In the episode Deacon Stan, Jesus Man from Season 1, Stan impulsively decides to become a deacon at his church based on very little thought or preparation. He sees that the position is available and immediately commits to taking it without understanding what the role requires or whether he is suited for it. When problems arise from his lack of preparation, Stan does not acknowledge that rushing into the decision was a mistake. Instead, he tries to fake his way through situations he is not equipped to handle. A psychologist would recognize this as impulsive commitment followed by inability to admit the impulsivity was problematic. Stan's impulsive decision-making also appears in how he responds to problems. When a challenge arises, Stan immediately jumps to action without assessing the situation or considering different approaches. He has extremely low tolerance for the discomfort of sitting with a problem and thinking it through. He needs to be doing something immediately, even if that something is not well considered or likely to help. The show demonstrates this pattern repeatedly through Stan's tendency to make situations worse by acting impulsively when patience would serve him better. A psychologist would observe that Stan's impulsivity is driven partly by anxiety. Taking time to think creates anxiety because it means tolerating uncertainty. Acting immediately reduces anxiety in the short term, even when it creates bigger problems in the long term. Stan's risk-taking also manifests in his work at the CIA, where he often volunteers for dangerous missions or takes unnecessary risks during operations. Stan does not appear to have normal fear responses that would make him cautious in dangerous situations. He either does not fully process the risks he is taking, or he enjoys the adrenaline and excitement of danger. This creates a pattern where Stan puts himself and others in harm's way through reckless behavior. In various episodes featuring Stan's CIA work, he takes risks that more cautious agents would avoid. He does not follow protocols designed to keep agents safe. He improvises in situations where following established procedures would be wiser. A psychologist would recognize that this risk-taking serves Stan's need to feel brave and capable. Taking risks proves to himself and others that he is fearless, which reinforces his masculine identity. Stan's impulsivity also affects his financial decisions. He makes major purchases without consulting his wife or considering their budget. He invests money in schemes that are obviously problematic. He commits financial resources to projects without doing basic research or planning. This pattern creates financial stress for his family and leads to repeated money problems that could be avoided through more careful decision-making. In the Vacation Goo from Season 3, it is revealed that Stan has been spending money on isolation tanks and drugs to fake family vacations rather than taking real vacations. This decision demonstrates Stan's impulsivity and poor judgment. He committed to an elaborate scheme without thinking through the long-term consequences or considering whether this was actually a good solution to the problem he was trying to solve. A psychologist would observe that Stan's impulsive decisions often create more problems than they solve. The show also demonstrates that Stan's impulsivity extends to his relationship. He makes major decisions about his family's lives without consulting them or considering their needs and preferences. He commits them to situations without their knowledge or consent. He assumes he knows what is best and acts on that assumption without gathering input from the people his decisions will affect. Stan's impulsive risk-taking also appears in how he handles confrontations and conflicts.
When someone challenges him or makes him angry, Stan escalates immediately to extreme measures. He does not try measured responses first. He does not attempt de-escalation or negotiation. He jumps straight to the most extreme response he can think of because his impulsivity combines with his aggression to create dangerous situations. In Chimdale, from Season 8, Stan's conflict with his neighbor over patriotism escalates quickly because Stan cannot control his impulses to one-up his opponent. Each escalation happens impulsively, without Stan stopping to consider whether this is wise or necessary. A psychologist would recognize this as impulsivity in the service of ego protection. Stan's need to win overrides his ability to make rational decisions about his behavior. Stan's impulsive decision-making also prevents him from learning from experience. Because he makes decisions so quickly, he does not spend time reflecting on past decisions or considering what he could do differently next time. He moves from one impulsive decision to the next without the pause that learning requires. This creates a pattern where Stan repeats the same mistakes throughout the series without recognizing that he is doing so. The show reveals that Stan's impulsivity is connected to his need for control and his discomfort with uncertainty. When faced with a situation he cannot control, Stan's impulse is to take action immediately. Doing something gives him the illusion of control, even when his actions do not actually improve the situation. A psychologist would recognize that Stan's impulsivity is a maladaptive coping mechanism for anxiety about uncertainty and lack of control. Stan's risk-taking also appears in how he approaches his role as a parent. He makes impulsive decisions about his children's lives that put them in awkward or dangerous situations. He signs them up for activities without asking if they are interested. He creates situations meant to teach them lessons without thinking through the potential negative consequences. His impulsive parenting creates problems that more thoughtful parenting would avoid. In All About Steve from Season 1, Stan impulsively decides to make Steve more popular by manipulating social situations. He acts on this impulse whether this is what Steve actually wants or needs. A psychologist would observe that Stan's impulsive parenting often serves Stan's needs more than his children's needs. He acts to relieve his own anxiety rather than to genuinely help his kids. The show also demonstrates that Stan's impulsivity makes him vulnerable to manipulation by others. People who want to influence Stan's behavior learn that if they present ideas in ways that trigger his impulsive tendencies, Stan will commit to courses of action without thinking them through. This makes Stan easy to manipulate, despite his apparent confidence and authority. Stan's impulsive risk-taking also extends to lying and deception. When caught in difficult situations, Stan impulsively lies rather than dealing with the situation honestly. These impulsive lies then require more lies to maintain, creating elaborate deceptions that eventually collapse. Stan does not plan his lies carefully. He tells whatever lie comes to mind in the moment and then has to improvise to maintain the deception. In various episodes throughout the series, Stan's impulsive lies create cascading problems that require increasingly desperate measures to manage. A psychologist would recognize this as a pattern where short-term impulsive choices to avoid discomfort create long-term problems that are much worse than the original situation Stan was trying to avoid. Stan's impulsivity also prevents him from developing expertise or mastery in areas outside his core competencies. Because he jumps into situations without proper preparation or learning, he remains superficial in his understanding and skills. He does not invest the time that genuine mastery requires because he impulsively moves from one interest to the next without sustained commitment to any of them. The show reveals this pattern through Stan's various hobbies and interests that he adopts impulsively and then abandons when they become difficult or boring. A psychologist would observe that Stan's impulsivity prevents the sustained effort that achievement requires. He wants immediate success and immediate gratification, which means he cannot develop the patience that real accomplishment demands. Stan's risk-taking also appears in his disregard for rules and procedures when they feel inconvenient. He impulsively breaks rules that he enforces rigidly on others. He takes shortcuts that create safety hazards. He ignores warnings and precautions because they slow him down or contradict what he wants to do. This selective rule following creates dangers that following proper procedures would prevent. In examining Stan's impulsivity and risk-taking, a psychologist would see someone whose need for action and decisiveness overrides his capacity for thoughtful judgment. Stan cannot tolerate the uncertainty and discomfort that comes with careful decision-making. He needs to act immediately to relieve the anxiety that uncertainty creates. This pattern leads him to make repeated poor decisions that create problems for himself and his family. The show also demonstrates that Stan's impulsivity is reinforced by occasional success. Sometimes his impulsive decisions work out well, often through luck rather than skill. These successes convince Stan that his approach is correct and reinforce his pattern of impulsive decision-making. A psychologist would recognize that intermittent reinforcement is particularly powerful in maintaining behavior patterns. The occasional success from impulsive decisions makes Stan more committed to impulsivity, even though most of his impulsive choices create problems. Stan's impulsive risk-taking also prevents him from developing the emotional regulation skills that would allow him to pause and think before acting. He goes directly from feeling to action, without the intermediate step of reflection. This lack of emotional regulation makes him reactive rather than responsive. He reacts to situations based on immediate feelings rather than responding thoughtfully based on values and goals. Stan's impulsivity also affects how he processes information about potential consequences. When considering a course of action, most people imagine possible outcomes and use that imagination to guide their decisions. Stan appears to have difficulty with this kind of thinking. He does not vividly imagine how his actions might turn out. He focuses on the immediate situation and the immediate gratification that action provides. The show reveals this limitation through situations where Stan proceeds with plans that obviously will end badly to everyone except Stan himself. Other characters warn him about likely consequences, yet Stan cannot visualize those consequences clearly enough for them to affect his behavior. A psychologist would recognize this as a deficit that makes learning from experience particularly difficult. In understanding Stan's impulsivity and risk-taking, it becomes clear that these patterns serve psychological functions for him, even as they create problems. Acting impulsively allows Stan to avoid the discomfort of uncertainty. Taking risks allows him to prove his bravery and competence. Making quick decisions allows him to appear strong and decisive. These psychological payoffs reinforce the patterns even when the objective outcomes are negative. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. These impulsive patterns reveal how Stan approaches questions of right and wrong. His need for certainty and his tendency toward extremes shape his moral reasoning in distinctive ways. Section 9. Moral certainty and judgment. Stan Smith operates with absolute moral certainty about right and wrong. A psychologist observing Stan would notice that he divides the world into clear categories of good and evil, with no room for ambiguity or complexity. Stan believes he knows the correct moral position on virtually every issue, and he judges others harshly based on how well they conform to his moral standards. This moral rigidity creates significant problems in his relationships and prevents him from understanding perspectives different from his own. Stan's moral certainty is rooted in the same cognitive rigidity that affects his thinking in other areas. Just as he cannot tolerate complexity in his understanding of facts and information, he cannot tolerate moral complexity. Situations must be clearly right or clearly wrong. People must be clearly good or clearly bad. The idea that moral questions might have multiple valid perspectives, or that context might matter in determining right action, is deeply uncomfortable for Stan. Throughout the series, Stan demonstrates that his moral judgments come quickly and absolutely. He does not deliberate about moral questions. He does not consider different perspectives or weigh competing values. He simply knows what is right, based on his existing beliefs, and judges accordingly. This creates a pattern where Stan makes harsh moral judgments about others while failing to apply the same standards to his own behavior. In the episode Lincoln Lover from Season 2, Stan discovers that the Log Cabin Republicans, a group of gay Republicans, are meeting at his home. Stan is deeply conflicted because these individuals share his political beliefs while being gay, which contradicts his views about sexuality. His moral certainty is challenged because the categories he uses to judge people do not fit neatly. A psychologist would observe that when Stan's moral categories are challenged, he experiences significant distress rather than reconsidering his categories. Stan's moral judgments are also highly selective in their application. He holds others to strict moral standards while making exceptions for himself when those same standards would be inconvenient. He judges his daughter Haley harshly for her liberal political views and her lifestyle choices, yet he engages in behaviors that violate his own stated moral principles without recognizing the hypocrisy. This double standard reveals that Stan's moral judgments serve to maintain his sense of superiority
rather than to guide his own behavior consistently. The show demonstrates this pattern in numerous episodes where Stan condemns behaviors in others that he practices himself. He judges people for dishonesty while lying regularly. He criticizes others for selfishness while acting selfishly. He condemns moral failures in others while failing to meet his own standards. A psychologist would recognize this as motivated reasoning, where Stan's moral judgments are shaped by what serves his psychological needs rather than by consistent principles. Stan's moral certainty also manifests in his relationship with his daughter Haley, whose liberal political views represent everything Stan believes is wrong. Stan does not simply disagree with Haley's positions, he judges her morally for holding them. He sees her activism in her causes as evidence of moral failing, rather than as different perspectives. This prevents any genuine dialogue between them, because Stan approaches their differences as moral battles, rather than as opportunities for understanding. In various episodes featuring conflicts between Stan and Haley, Stan treats her political views as personal betrayals, rather than as different opinions. He cannot separate disagreement from moral condemnation. A psychologist would observe that this inability to tolerate moral disagreement damages Stan's relationship with his daughter and prevents him from understanding her as a person separate from her political beliefs. Stan's moral judgments are also influenced heavily by authority and tradition. He tends to believe that established rules and traditional practices are morally correct simply because they are established and traditional. He does not question whether laws are just or whether traditional practices serve good purposes. He assumes that what has been must be right. This creates a moral framework that is conservative and resistant to change. The show reveals this pattern through Stan's resistance to social progress and his defense of traditional institutions, regardless of their actual moral merit. Stan supports practices and policies not because he has thought through their moral implications, yet because they represent established order. A psychologist would recognize this as authoritarian moral reasoning, where obedience to established authority substitutes for genuine moral reflection. Stan's moral certainty also prevents him from feeling appropriate guilt or remorse when he causes harm to others. Because Stan believes his intentions are good and his moral framework is correct, he has difficulty accepting responsibility when his actions hurt people. He rationalizes harmful behavior as necessary or justified, rather than acknowledging that he did something wrong. This prevents him from making genuine amends or changing his behavior. In Homeland Insecurity from Season 1, Stan racially profiles his neighbors and subjects them to invasive surveillance based purely on stereotypes. When his actions are revealed to be based on prejudice rather than actual threats, Stan does not express genuine remorse or reconsider his approach to security. A psychologist would observe that Stan's moral certainty protects him from experiencing guilt that would otherwise motivate behavior change. Stan's judgmental nature also extends to how he views people who make different lifestyle choices than he does. He judges people based on their appearance, their occupation, their political beliefs, their relationship choices, and countless other factors. These judgments are immediate and absolute. Stan decides very quickly whether someone is worthy of respect based on superficial characteristics that align with his values. The show demonstrates this through Stan's interactions with people outside his narrow worldview. He dismisses entire groups of people based on categories, rather than treating individuals as individuals. A psychologist would recognize this as prejudice, rooted in Stan's need for simple moral categories that allow him to feel superior to others. Stan's moral framework also includes strong beliefs about gender roles and masculinity that he enforces rigidly on himself and others. He believes men should behave in certain ways and women should behave in certain ways. Deviation from these gender expectations is not simply different to Stan, it is morally wrong. This creates particular problems with his son Steve, whose interests and personality do not align with Stan's rigid conception of appropriate masculine behavior. In episodes featuring Steve's artistic interests or emotional sensitivity, Stan treats these characteristics as moral failings that need to be corrected, rather than as natural variations in personality and interest. Stan's moral certainty about proper gender roles prevents him from accepting his son as he is. A psychologist would observe that Stan's rigid gender beliefs cause him to reject aspects of his children that do not conform to his narrow moral categories. Stan's moral judgments are also remarkably resistant to evidence or experience. When Stan encounters situations that should challenge his moral certainty, he finds ways to maintain his existing beliefs rather than revising them. He dismisses contradictory evidence, reinterprets experiences to fit his framework, and refuses to acknowledge when his moral judgments have been proven wrong. The show reveals this pattern through situations where Stan's moral certainty leads him to make mistakes that harm himself and others. Even when the negative consequences are clear, Stan rarely revises his underlying moral framework. A psychologist would recognize this as defensive processing, where maintaining existing beliefs matters more than learning from experience. Stan's moral certainty also affects his ability to forgive others or to accept forgiveness himself. Because he sees moral questions in such absolute terms, he has difficulty extending grace to people who violate his moral standards. Similarly, because he cannot easily admit his own moral failures, he has difficulty accepting forgiveness or making genuine apologies. In various episodes throughout the series, conflicts remain unresolved because Stan cannot bring himself to apologize sincerely or to forgive genuinely. His moral rigidity prevents the flexibility that healthy relationships require. A psychologist would observe that Stan's inability to engage in repair processes damages his relationships and leaves conflicts festering. Stan's judgmental nature also creates a household atmosphere where his children feel judged and evaluated constantly. They cannot simply be themselves without facing Stan's moral assessments of their choices and behavior. This creates pressure to conform to Stan's expectations and prevents his children from developing their own moral frameworks through exploration and experience. The show demonstrates this through Haley's rebellion against Stan's values and Steve's attempts to hide aspects of himself that Stan would judge negatively. Stan's children have learned that genuine acceptance from Stan is conditional on conforming to his moral expectations. A psychologist would recognize this as an unhealthy family dynamic, where children cannot develop authentic identities. Stan's moral certainty also extends to his work at the CIA, where he believes strongly in the righteousness of American intelligence operations. He does not question whether the missions he participates in are morally justified. He assumes that because they serve American interests, they must be right. This prevents him from engaging in moral reflection about the actual consequences of his work. In episodes featuring Stan's CIA activities, he participates in operations that have questionable moral status without apparent internal conflict. Stan's moral certainty about American righteousness allows him to avoid grappling with the moral complexity of intelligence work. A psychologist would observe that this moral certainty serves a protective function, allowing Stan to maintain positive self-regard while doing work that might otherwise create moral distress. Stan's judgmental approach to others also reveals significant projection. The behaviors and characteristics that Stan judges most harshly in others are often the very things he struggles with himself. He condemns weakness in others while hiding his own vulnerabilities. He judges dishonesty in others while lying frequently himself. He criticizes selfishness in others while prioritizing his own needs regularly. The show reveals this pattern through the gap between Stan's moral pronouncements and his actual behavior. A psychologist would recognize that Stan's harsh judgments of others serve partly to deny and disown aspects of himself that he cannot accept. Stan's moral framework also lacks nuance in understanding human motivation and behavior. He judges actions without considering context, circumstances, or the complexity of human psychology. He believes people do wrong things because they are bad people, rather than understanding that good people sometimes make mistakes or face difficult circumstances that lead to poor choices. This simplistic view of human behavior prevents Stan from developing empathy or understanding for people who struggle or fail. He sees moral failure as evidence of character deficiency, rather than as a normal part of being human. A psychologist would observe that this lack of psychological sophistication in Stan's moral reasoning prevents him from offering genuine compassion or support to people who need it. In examining Stan's moral certainty and judgmental nature, a psychologist would see someone who uses moral rigidity as a defense against complexity and uncertainty. Stan needs to believe in clear right and wrong because moral ambiguity creates anxiety. His harsh judgments of others serve to maintain his sense of superiority and to avoid examining his own failures. This pattern provides short-term comfort while creating long-term problems in his relationships and preventing genuine moral development. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Despite all these rigid patterns and defensive mechanisms, Stan occasionally shows glimpses of genuine emotional depth and growth. These rare moments reveal what Stan might be capable of if his defenses were not so firmly in place. Section 10. Emotional growth moments. Despite Stan Smith's rigidity, defensiveness, and emotional suppression, The series occasionally shows moments where Stan experiences genuine emotional growth or displays vulnerability that breaks through his usual patterns. A psychologist observing these moments would see glimpses of Stan's potential for change and deeper emotional capacity. These moments are significant precisely because they are so rare, and because they reveal what Stan keeps hidden beneath his aggressive exterior. They show that another version of Stan exists beneath the defenses, a version that is more emotionally available and capable of genuine connection. These growth moments typically occur under specific circumstances that overwhelm Stan's usual defensive patterns. Stan must be confronted with consequences so severe that his usual defenses cannot protect him from the emotional reality. Or he must encounter situations that bypass his intellectual defenses and touch him emotionally in ways he cannot ignore or rationalize away. Or someone must reach him in a moment when his guard is down and his defenses are temporarily inactive. These breakthrough moments reveal that Stan is capable of more emotional depth and flexibility than his typical behavior suggests. In the episode Tears of a Clooney from Season 2, Stan's emotional suppression is taken to its literal extreme when he decides to address what he sees as a weakness. He has his tear ducts surgically sealed because he believes crying is weakness, and he wants to eliminate his capacity for this vulnerable expression. Throughout the episode, Stan suffers from his inability to cry even when experiencing genuine sadness and emotional pain. His body needs to cry, yet cannot, creating physical and emotional distress. By the end of the episode, Stan learns through painful experience that crying serves important emotional and physical functions that cannot simply be eliminated without consequences. This episode represents one of Stan's clearest moments of emotional growth in the entire series. He recognizes that his approach to emotions is actually harmful rather than protective. He makes a concrete change to allow himself to experience and express vulnerable feelings again. A psychologist would observe that this represents genuine insight into his emotional patterns and willingness to change behavior based on that insight. The episode shows Stan learning that vulnerability is not the same as weakness, and that eliminating vulnerability eliminates important parts of being human. However, the show also demonstrates that these moments of growth rarely produce lasting change in Stan's overall patterns of behavior. In subsequent episodes after Tears of a Clooney, Stan returns to his usual emotional suppression and avoidance of vulnerable feelings. The insight he gained about the value of emotional expression does not fundamentally alter his approach to feelings in his daily life. This reveals a pattern where Stan has moments of growth and genuine learning without integrating those insights into his ongoing behavior. The growth happens in isolated moments, rather than becoming part of his character development. Stan's growth moments often occur in his relationship with his son Steve. Despite Stan's generally poor parenting and his rejection of Steve's sensitive nature, there are episodes where Stan genuinely connects with Steve emotionally and shows real understanding and acceptance of who Steve actually is. These moments are particularly meaningful because Stan's relationship with Steve is so often strained by Stan's inability to accept Steve's interests, personality, and emotional nature. When Stan can temporarily set aside his agenda, real connection becomes possible. In various episodes throughout the series, Stan has opportunities to see Steve's perspective or to recognize Steve's worth, independent of whether Steve conforms to Stan's expectations for masculine behavior. In these moments, Stan drops his constant project to toughen Steve up and simply relates to his son as a person with inherent value. A psychologist would observe that these moments show Stan is capable of genuine parental love and acceptance when he can get past his anxiety about Steve's masculinity and his fears about what Steve's sensitivity means. The pattern in Stan's growth moments reveals several important things about his psychology. First, Stan is not incapable of emotional depth or change. He has the capacity for these things within him, yet his defenses prevent him from accessing that capacity regularly or consistently. Second, Stan's growth moments tend to be triggered by external circumstances rather than by internal reflection or self-examination. Stan does not spontaneously decide to grow or change through introspection. Something must force him to confront his patterns from the outside. Stan's moments of vulnerability also reveal the depth of his insecurity and fear beneath his confident exterior. When Stan's defenses come down temporarily, what emerges is not arrogance and certainty. What emerges is fear, sadness, and a desperate need for connection and acceptance that he normally keeps hidden. These vulnerable moments show that Stan's aggressive confidence is indeed covering profound insecurity and deep emotional needs that go unmet. In episodes where Stan faces genuine threats to his safety or his family's safety, his emotional responses become more authentic and less controlled. The immediate danger bypasses his usual emotional control mechanisms and forces genuine feeling to the surface. Fear for his family's well-being or his own survival breaks through the emotional walls he normally maintains. A psychologist would observe that crisis situations can temporarily disable defensive patterns, allowing more authentic emotional responses to emerge that reveal Stan's true feelings. Stan's growth moments also sometimes occur in his relationship with Francine. Despite the problems in their marriage and Stan's general emotional unavailability, there are episodes where Stan genuinely recognizes Francine's worth and expresses authentic appreciation and love for her. These moments show that Stan does value his wife and his marriage deeply, even though his typical behavior does not reflect this. He takes Francine for granted most of the time, yet he is capable of seeing and appreciating her. The show reveals these moments through episodes where Stan must confront the possibility of losing Francine, or where he realizes he has taken her for granted in ways that have hurt her. In these situations, Stan's genuine feelings of love and appreciation break through his defenses and his tendency to treat Francine as a servant rather than as a partner. A psychologist would observe that the threat of loss can motivate emotional authenticity that ordinary circumstances do not produce in someone as defended as Stan. Stan's growth moments also reveal his capacity for self-awareness when his defenses are not actively protecting him from painful truths. In rare instances, Stan recognizes his own patterns and acknowledges the harm they cause to himself and others. He sees himself clearly for brief moments before his defenses reassert themselves and obscure his vision again. These glimpses of insight show that Stan has some awareness of his psychological patterns, even if he cannot maintain that awareness consistently or use it to change his behavior. The show demonstrates this through moments where Stan makes surprisingly insightful comments about his own behavior or motivations, before quickly reverting to his usual lack of self-awareness. A psychologist would recognize these as moments when Stan's observing ego briefly overcomes his defensive ego, allowing him to see himself from an outside perspective as others see him. Stan's emotional growth moments also tend to occur in situations involving his father or his childhood experiences. When Stan confronts his abandonment and the poverty and instability of his early life, his defenses sometimes crack enough to allow genuine grief and pain to emerge. These moments reveal how much of Stan's current psychology is shaped by unresolved childhood trauma that continues to affect him. The wounds from his father's abandonment and his difficult childhood remain active beneath the surface. In Con Air from Season 3, Stan's reunion with his father forces him to confront feelings he has avoided for decades. While Stan ultimately cannot sustain the vulnerability this reunion requires and returns to his defended state, the episode shows moments where genuine emotion breaks through his usual patterns. A psychologist would observe that childhood wounds remain powerful sources of feeling that can bypass adult defenses when triggered directly. The pattern in Stan's growth moments also reveals that genuine connection with others is what most reliably produces emotional growth and breakthrough moments. When Stan experiences authentic connection with family members or friends, when he allows himself to be truly seen and accepted rather than maintaining his persona, these experiences create possibilities for growth and change. The problem is that Stan's defenses prevent such connections most of the time, keeping him isolated even when surrounded by family. The show demonstrates this through rare moments where Stan drops his persona and relates to others genuinely without trying to control, judge, or dominate the interaction. These moments of real connection feel qualitatively different from Stan's typical interactions with others. A psychologist would observe that humans need authentic connection for psychological growth, and Stan's defenses against connection therefore prevent the growth he needs. Stan's growth moments also sometimes occur through unexpected sources of wisdom or perspective. Occasionally, another character says something that penetrates Stan's defenses and makes him reconsider his position or see things differently. These moments show that Stan can be reached through the right words at the right time, even though he typically dismisses input from others without consideration. In examining the pattern of Stan's growth moments across the series, several themes emerge clearly. Stan's growth occurs in brief flashes rather than sustained development. He has insights without integration into his ongoing behavior. He experiences vulnerability without allowing it to change his defensive structure permanently. He shows emotional depth in isolated moments without allowing that depth to inform his daily behavior and relationships. A psychologist would observe that Stan appears to have what therapists call a high defensive structure. His defenses are strong, well-established, and resistant to change. Breaking through these defenses requires significant force or the perfect circumstance. When breakthroughs occur, they produce genuine moments of growth and connection. However, Stan's defenses quickly reassert themselves after the immediate crisis passes, and the growth does not stick or produce lasting change. The show also reveals that Stan has access to different parts of himself in different contexts and situations. In some situations, his defenses are less active, and he can access more emotional flexibility and authenticity. In other situations, his defenses lock down completely, and he becomes rigid and unavailable. Understanding when and why Stan's defenses fluctuate could provide insight into how lasting change might occur for someone with his psychological structure. Stan's growth moments also tend to be followed by a return to baseline behavior fairly quickly. After experiencing vulnerability or insight, Stan typically reverts to his normal patterns within an episode or two. This suggests that Stan's psychological equilibrium is strongly established and self-correcting. Temporary disruptions to that equilibrium are corrected by his psychological system, returning him to familiar patterns that feel safer. A psychologist would recognize this as illustrating the challenge of therapeutic change. Insights and growth experiences must be reinforced and integrated over time through sustained effort to produce lasting change. Isolated moments of growth without sustained support, practice, and reinforcement typically do not alter long-standing patterns that serve important psychological functions. The series demonstrates through Stan's character that change is possible, yet difficult for someone with his psychological structure. Stan shows capacity for growth, insight, vulnerability, and connection in these brief moments. He also shows powerful defenses that prevent sustained access to these capacities most of the time. His story illustrates how defensive patterns that protect against anxiety also prevent the growth and connection that make life meaningful and relationships satisfying. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. These occasional growth moments connect to broader patterns that run through Stan's entire psychological makeup. Understanding how all these threads weave together reveals the complete picture of who Stan Smith is and why he behaves the way he does. Section 11. Stan Smith's Psychological Threads. A psychologist examining Stan Smith's complete psychological profile would see not isolated symptoms or individual quirks, yet a complex web of interconnected patterns that work together to create his personality. Each aspect of Stan's psychology that we have explored connects to and reinforces the others. His identity built on patriotism connects to his emotional repression. His need to protect his family connects to his insecurity. His cognitive rigidity connects to his moral certainty. Understanding how these threads weave together reveals why Stan is the way he is and why changing any single pattern would be so difficult for him. Stan's identity as a patriotic American and CIA agent serves as the foundation for much of his psychology. This external identity prevents him from developing a genuine internal sense of self. Because Stan has outsourced his identity to America and the CIA, he does not know who he would be without these affiliations. This creates deep anxiety about anything that might threaten his connection to these external sources of identity. His rigid patriotism is not just a political position, it is psychological survival. This reliance on external identity directly connects to Stan's profound insecurity beneath his confident exterior. Because Stan does not have a solid internal sense of worth, he needs constant external validation to feel okay about himself. His patriotic identity provides some of this validation by making him part of something larger and more important than himself. His role at the CIA provides validation by making him feel powerful and necessary. When these sources of validation are threatened, Stan's insecurity breaks through and he becomes desperate to prove his worth. Stan's insecurity also drives his need to be the family protector. By making himself essential to his family's safety, Stan creates a role that validates his existence and makes him feel valuable. This is why Stan sees threats everywhere and intervenes in his family's lives so aggressively. The threats justify his protective role, and his protective role justifies his existence. A psychologist would observe that Stan needs his family to need him, which is why he cannot allow them to develop independence or handle problems on their own. This protective compulsion connects directly to Stan's need for control. Stan cannot tolerate uncertainty about his family's safety or about anything else in his life. Control reduces uncertainty, so Stan tries to control everything and everyone around him. His rigid rules, his surveillance of family members, his quick decisions, and his aggressive interventions all serve his need to feel in control of situations that are actually beyond anyone's control. Stan's need for control also manifests in his cognitive rigidity and his inability to tolerate complexity or ambiguity. If Stan allowed himself to see the world as complex and uncertain, he would experience overwhelming anxiety. So his mind forces everything into simple, rigid categories. This cognitive rigidity protects him from anxiety while preventing him from understanding reality accurately. The world is not as simple as Stan needs it to be, yet acknowledging complexity would mean tolerating uncertainty. This same rigidity appears in Stan's moral certainty. Just as he cannot tolerate factual complexity, he cannot tolerate moral complexity. Situations must be clearly right or wrong. People must be clearly good or bad. Moral ambiguity creates the same anxiety that factual ambiguity creates. Stan's harsh judgments of others serve multiple psychological functions. They maintain his sense of superiority, they create simple moral categories that reduce uncertainty, and they allow him to project his own unacceptable qualities onto others. Stan's emotional repression connects to almost every other aspect of his psychology. Expressing vulnerable emotions would undermine his masculine identity and his role as protector. It would reveal his insecurity and contradict his confident persona. It would require acknowledging complexity in his internal experience. So Stan suppresses vulnerable feelings and converts them into anger and aggression, the only emotions that feel safe to him. This emotional suppression prevents genuine connection with his family and leaves him isolated, despite being surrounded by people who love him. The emotional repression also fuels Stan's impulsivity. Because Stan cannot sit with uncomfortable feelings and think through situations, he acts immediately to relieve emotional discomfort. His impulsive decisions allow him to avoid feeling uncertain, anxious, or vulnerable. Action provides the illusion of control and decisiveness that Stan desperately needs. His impulsivity serves his need to appear strong and certain, while actually revealing how poorly he tolerates normal human emotions. Stan's social confidence emerges from this same web of patterns. His confidence is not based on genuine self-esteem or social skills. It comes from his refusal to question himself and his complete disregard for others' perspectives. Because Stan does not reflect on his behavior or care about others' opinions, he appears confident. This confidence allows him to dominate social situations and maintain his sense of superiority. It also prevents him from developing genuine relationships based on mutual respect and vulnerability. All of these patterns work together to keep Stan stuck in a psychological equilibrium that is rigid and dysfunctional, yet stable. Each pattern supports the others. His patriotic identity reinforces his moral certainty. His moral certainty reinforces his cognitive rigidity. His cognitive rigidity reinforces his emotional repression. His emotional repression reinforces his need for control. His need for control reinforces his protective compulsion. His protective compulsion reinforces his identity as the strong protector. The entire system is self-reinforcing. This is why the occasional moments of growth and vulnerability that Stan experiences do not produce lasting change. To change any one pattern would require changing the entire interconnected system. Stan would need to develop a genuine internal identity, which would require confronting his insecurity, which would require experiencing vulnerable emotions, which would require giving up his rigid defenses, which would mean tolerating uncertainty and complexity. The entire psychological structure would need to shift, which is extremely difficult and anxiety-provoking. A psychologist would recognize that Stan's psychological patterns developed for good reasons. As a child, Stan experienced poverty, instability, and abandonment by his father. These experiences taught him that the world is dangerous and unpredictable, that he cannot rely on others, and that showing vulnerability leads to pain. Stan developed his current patterns as a way to survive these early experiences and to protect himself from being hurt again. The patriotic identity gave young Stan something stable to believe in when everything else was unstable. The emotional repression protected him from feeling the pain of his father's abandonment. The rigid thinking reduced the overwhelming complexity of a chaotic childhood. The protective compulsion allowed him to feel powerful instead of powerless. The aggressive confidence covered his shame about poverty and rejection. These patterns made sense as adaptations to difficult circumstances. The problem is that Stan never updated these patterns as his circumstances changed. The defenses that helped him survive a difficult childhood now prevent him from thriving in adult relationships. He treats his stable family life as if it were as dangerous and unstable as his childhood. He protects his children from threats that do not exist while creating real threats through his controlling behavior. He maintains defenses against vulnerability, even though he is now in relationships where vulnerability would be safe and beneficial. Stan's psychology also reveals the costs of living behind rigid defenses. His defenses protect him from experiencing certain uncomfortable emotions, yet they also prevent him from experiencing positive emotions fully. His emotional repression keeps him from feeling deep pain, yet it also keeps him from feeling deep joy or love. His rigid thinking protects him from confusion and uncertainty, yet it also prevents curiosity and growth. His moral certainty protects him from doubt, yet it also prevents wisdom and understanding. The defenses that Stan uses to feel safe actually make him less safe in important ways. His inability to acknowledge mistakes means he keeps making the same mistakes. His refusal to listen to others means he misses important information. His need to control everything means he cannot adapt when control is impossible. His emotional unavailability damages the relationships that could provide genuine safety and support. The very patterns meant to protect him end up harming him. Stan's psychological structure also shows how defenses can become more important than the things they are supposed to defend. Stan's defenses were originally meant to protect his sense of self and to help him function in the world. Now the defenses themselves have become so rigid and all-encompassing that they prevent the functioning they are supposed to enable. Stan maintains his confident persona at the cost of genuine self-esteem. He maintains control at the cost of genuine security. He maintains his patriotic identity at the cost of authentic selfhood. A psychologist would also observe that Stan's patterns create a particular kind of loneliness. Stan is surrounded by family and coworkers, yet his defenses prevent genuine connection with any of them. He cannot be truly known because he cannot be truly vulnerable. He cannot truly know others because he cannot see past his judgments and projections. His need to feel superior prevents pure relationships. His need to control prevents intimate relationships. He exists among people while being fundamentally alone. The interconnected nature of Stan's patterns also explains why his family has trouble helping him change. When Francine tries to get Stan to be more emotionally available, she is challenging not just his emotional repression, yet his entire sense of masculine identity and his role as protector. When Haley challenges his political views, she is threatening not just his opinions, yet his fundamental sense of identity and worth. When Steve wants acceptance for his sensitivity, he is asking Stan to question beliefs about masculinity that are central to Stan's entire psychological structure. Understanding these psychological threads also reveals why certain situations trigger Stan more than others. Threats to his patriotic identity create more anxiety than other kinds of threats, because that identity is so central to his psychology. Situations that require emotional vulnerability create more defensiveness than other situations because vulnerability threatens so many of his patterns at once. Challenges to his role as protector create more aggressive responses because that role serves so many psychological functions simultaneously. Stan's psychology also demonstrates how patterns that work in one domain can create problems in another domain. Stan's decisiveness and confidence serve him relatively well in his CIA work, where quick action and self-assurance are valuable. These same qualities create significant problems in his family life, where thoughtfulness and emotional availability are needed. His ability to suppress emotions and follow orders helps him function as an agent, yet this same ability damages his role as a husband and father. The complexity of Stan's psychological structure also explains why simple interventions would not work to help him change. Telling Stan to be more emotionally open would not work because his emotional repression serves too many functions. Telling him to be less controlling would not work because his need for control is tied to his identity and his anxiety management. Helping Stan change would require addressing the entire interconnected system of patterns, not just individual symptoms. A psychologist working with Stan would need to help him develop a genuine internal identity to replace his external identity. They would need to help him learn to tolerate uncomfortable emotions instead of acting impulsively to avoid them. They would need to help him develop cognitive flexibility to replace his rigid thinking. They would need to help him build genuine self-esteem to replace his defensive confidence. Each of these changes would support the others, yet making any of them would be extremely difficult because the entire system resists change. In examining how all these psychological threads weave together in Stan Smith, we see a picture of someone who has built an elaborate defensive structure to protect himself from pain and uncertainty. This structure has costs and benefits. It allows Stan to function in his work and to maintain relationships with his family. It also prevents genuine connection, limits his emotional life, and keeps him stuck in patterns that create problems. Understanding these interconnections helps explain why Stan is the way he is, and what it would take for him to change. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. These interconnected patterns in Stan's psychology reveal important lessons about human behavior and the costs of living defensively. What we learn from examining Stan extends beyond understanding one fictional character. Section 12. What we learn from Stan's behavioral patterns. Analyzing Stan Smith's psychology teaches us important lessons about how defense mechanisms work, why people resist change, and what happens when someone builds their entire personality around, quote, avoiding vulnerability. While Stan is a fictional character designed for comedy, the psychological patterns he displays are real patterns that appear in actual people. Understanding what drives Stan's behavior helps us understand similar patterns in ourselves and in people around us. The first major lesson from Stan's psychology is how defense mechanisms can become prisons. Stan developed his defensive patterns to protect himself from pain, uncertainty, and vulnerability. These defenses worked in the sense that they allowed him to function and to avoid certain uncomfortable feelings. However, over time, the defenses became so rigid and all-encompassing that they now limit Stan's life more than they protect it. He cannot experience joy fully because of his emotional repression. He cannot have genuine relationships because of his need for control. He cannot grow as a person because of his cognitive rigidity. This reveals an important truth about psychological defenses. They provide short-term relief from discomfort while creating long-term problems. Stan feels safer in the moment when he suppresses vulnerable emotions, yet this pattern leaves him isolated and unable to connect with his family. He feels more in control when he makes quick, impulsive decisions, yet this pattern leads to repeated mistakes and crises. The defenses that seem to help actually hurt. A related lesson is how external sources of identity prevent genuine self-development. Stan built his identity around being a patriotic American and a CIA agent, instead of developing a sense of self based on his own values, interests, and qualities. This external identity gives Stan something to hold on to, yet it also makes him completely dependent on maintaining his connection to America and the CIA. He does not know who he would be without these affiliations. This teaches us that genuine identity must come from within rather than from external sources, no matter how important those sources seem. Stan's psychology also teaches us about the connection between rigidity and anxiety. Stan's rigid thinking, rigid moral judgments, and rigid behavioral patterns all serve to reduce his anxiety about uncertainty and complexity. By forcing everything into simple categories and following inflexible rules, Stan creates an illusion of predictability and control. However, this rigidity actually increases anxiety in the long run because it prevents Stan from adapting to new situations and learning from experience. The world is complex and uncertain, and refusing to acknowledge this creates constant stress. This reveals that true comfort with uncertainty comes from developing flexibility and tolerance for ambiguity, not from trying to eliminate uncertainty through rigid thinking. Stan's approach of forcing the world into simple categories does not actually make the world simpler. It just makes Stan less able to deal with the complexity that exists. His rigid patterns feel protective in the moment, yet leave him increasingly unable to handle the unpredictability of real life. Another important lesson from Stan's psychology is how projection works in everyday life. Stan judges others harshly for qualities and behaviors that he himself displays. He condemns weakness while hiding his own vulnerability. He criticizes dishonesty while lying regularly. He judges selfishness while acting selfishly. This projection allows Stan to deny aspects of himself that he cannot accept. By seeing these qualities in others and condemning them there, Stan can maintain the illusion that he does not possess them himself. This teaches us to be curious about our own harsh judgments of others. When we find ourselves judging someone particularly harshly for a specific quality or behavior, it is worth asking whether we might be projecting something we cannot accept in ourselves. Our strongest judgments of others often reveal our own shadows. Stan's harsh judgments tell us more about what Stan cannot acknowledge in himself than they tell us about the people he is judging. Stan's psychology also demonstrates how childhood experiences shape adult patterns in powerful ways. Stan's difficult childhood taught him lessons about the world being dangerous, people being unreliable, and vulnerability leading to pain. These lessons made sense in the context of his childhood experiences. Yet Stan never questioned whether these lessons still apply in his adult life. He treats his stable family and his secure life as if they were as dangerous and unstable as his childhood. His father's abandonment decades ago still shapes how he relates to his own children today. This reveals that we all carry forward lessons from our past that may no longer serve us in the present. Being aware of how our early experiences shaped our current patterns allows us to question whether those patterns still make sense in our current circumstances. Stan cannot do this questioning because his defenses prevent self-reflection. Yet those of us who can engage in self-reflection have the opportunity to update our operating assumptions based on current reality rather than past experiences. Another lesson from Stan involves the relationship between control and anxiety. Stan's need to control everything stems from his anxiety about uncertainty and his fear that bad things will happen if he is not vigilant. He believes that control keeps his family safe and keeps his life predictable. However, Stan's attempts at control actually create more problems than they solve. His controlling behavior pushes his children to rebel and sneak around. His inability to tolerate uncertainty prevents him from adapting when situations change. His aggressive interventions often make situations worse rather than better. This teaches us that excessive control is usually a symptom of anxiety rather than an effective solution to problems. Real security comes from developing the ability to handle whatever happens, not from preventing things from happening in the first place. Stan's approach of trying to control everything is exhausting and ineffective, yet he cannot see this because his anxiety drives him to keep trying. The more he tries to control, the more out of control situations become. Stan's psychology also teaches about the importance of emotional expression for psychological health. Stan's suppression of vulnerable emotions seems to make him strong and unaffected by difficulty. In reality, his emotional repression creates significant problems. It prevents him from processing difficult experiences. It damages his relationships by making him emotionally unavailable. It forces all his emotions through the narrow channel of anger and aggression. It leaves him unable to experience the full range of human feelings. This reveals that emotional expression is not weakness. It is a necessary part of psychological health and relationship functioning. Allowing ourselves to feel and express the full range of emotions, including vulnerable ones, is what enables genuine connection and psychological well-being. Stan's attempt to be strong by suppressing feelings actually makes him weaker and more isolated. Stan's patterns also demonstrate how defense mechanisms prevent learning from experience. Stan encounters situations regularly that should teach him his approaches are not working. His impulsive decisions create crises. His controlling behavior pushes people away. His rigid thinking leads to mistakes. Yet Stan does not learn from these experiences because his defenses prevent him from acknowledging that his patterns are the problem. He blames others, makes excuses, or simply moves on to the next situation without reflection. This teaches us that genuine learning requires the ability to look honestly at our own role in creating problems. Defensive patterns that protect us from feeling bad about ourselves also prevent the self-examination that growth requires. Being willing to feel temporarily uncomfortable by acknowledging our mistakes is what allows us to learn and change. Stan cannot do this, so he stays stuck. Another important lesson from Stan is about the costs of living without self-awareness. Stan does not understand his own motivations, patterns, or psychology. He acts based on impulses and defenses without understanding why he does what he does. This lack of self-awareness means Stan keeps repeating the same patterns and making the same mistakes. He cannot change what he cannot see. His life stays the same year after year because he has no insight into what needs to change. This reveals the value of developing self-awareness and understanding our own psychology. When we understand why we do what we do, we have the power to make different choices. When we remain unaware of our patterns, we are trapped by them. Self-awareness is the foundation of all personal growth and change. Stan's psychology also teaches about how moral certainty can substitute for genuine moral development. Stan believes strongly in clear right and wrong, yet his moral certainty prevents him from engaging in real moral reflection. He does not think deeply about moral questions or consider different perspectives. He simply applies his existing moral categories automatically. This means Stan's moral framework never develops or becomes more sophisticated. He remains morally simplistic, no matter how old he gets. This teaches us that genuine moral development requires tolerance for moral complexity and willingness to engage with difficult questions. Moral certainty feels comfortable because it eliminates doubt, yet it prevents the kind of thoughtful moral reasoning that leads to wisdom and understanding. Real moral maturity involves grappling with complexity, not imposing simple categories. Stan's occasional moments of growth and vulnerability teach us something important as well. These moments show that Stan has the capacity for change, emotional depth, and genuine connection beneath his defenses. He is not incapable of these things. His defenses prevent him from accessing these capacities most of the time. This reveals that most people, no matter how defended or rigid they seem, have deeper capacities that their defenses hide. Seeing the person beneath the defenses allows for compassion and patience with them. These growth moments also teach us that change is possible, even for people with very rigid defensive structures. Stan's changes do not stick because they are not supported or reinforced. Yet the fact that they occur at all shows that breakthrough is possible. This suggests that with the right support, circumstances, and motivation, people can change even long-standing patterns. No one is completely stuck, even when they seem that way. Stan's story also teaches about the limitations of insight without action. Stan occasionally has genuine insights into his patterns and their costs. He recognizes that his emotional repression is harmful or that his controlling behavior damages relationships. However, these insights do not lead to sustained behavior change. Knowing something intellectually is different from changing behavior based on that knowledge. Awareness alone does not create transformation. This reveals that real change requires more than insight. It requires sustained effort, new behaviors practiced over time, support from others, and tolerance for the discomfort that change creates. Insight is necessary, yet not sufficient for transformation. Stan has moments of insight throughout the series, yet these moments fade without producing lasting change because he does not do the hard work that would be required to translate insight into new patterns. Finally, examining Stan's psychology teaches us about the human tendency to choose familiar discomfort over unfamiliar possibility. Stan's patterns create ongoing problems and limit his life significantly. Yet, he maintains these patterns because they are familiar, and because changing would create different kinds of discomfort. The unknown feels more threatening than the known problems. Stan knows how to be the person he has always been, even though that person is limited and suffering. He does not know how to be different, and not knowing feels more frightening than continuing to suffer. This helps explain why people often stay stuck in patterns that clearly are not working. Change requires moving into uncertainty and tolerating temporary increased discomfort, which is difficult even when the current situation is painful. Understanding this tendency allows for more compassion toward ourselves and others when change is slow or difficult. We are not weak or broken for staying in familiar patterns. We are human. In examining what we learn from Stan Smith's behavioral patterns, we see lessons about defenses, identity, emotions, rigidity, control, self-awareness, and change. Stan's psychology, while exaggerated for comedic effect, reflects real psychological patterns that many people struggle with. Understanding these patterns in Stan helps us recognize them in ourselves and approach them with greater awareness and compassion. The goal is not to eliminate all defenses or to become perfectly self-aware. The goal is to develop enough flexibility and insight to make genuine choices about how we want to live, rather than being trapped by unconscious patterns. Stan Smith offers a window into how human beings build defensive structures to protect themselves from pain and uncertainty. These structures serve important functions, yet also come with significant costs. Understanding these patterns, whether in fictional characters or in ourselves, is the first step toward greater self-awareness and the possibility of change. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.